The establishment of Heian in 794 marked a fundamental shift in Japanese governance that would inadvertently create the conditions for the rise of the warrior class. Emperor Kamu's decision to relocate the capital from Nara to what would become Kyoto represented more than mere political manoeuvring. It established a pattern of centralized court authority that would struggle to maintain control over Japan's vast and often rebellious provinces. The Heian court, obsessed with Chinese-inspired cultural refinement and Buddhist ceremonies, gradually withdrew from the practical concerns of military defense and provincial administration. This withdrawal created a power vacuum in the countryside that ambitious provincial families were quick to fill. The court's solution was to appoint local strongmen as estate managers and tax collectors, granting them significant autonomy in exchange for maintaining order and ensuring revenue flow to the capital. These appointments, initially temporary administrative positions, evolved into hereditary roles that concentrated both economic and military power in the hands of provincial warrior families. The court nobles, increasingly reluctant to leave their refined urban environment, became absentee landlords who relied entirely on these local administrators to manage their distant holdings. The transformation of these estate managers into a distinct warrior class occurred gradually through the 9th and 10th centuries. Unlike the conscript armies of the earlier Nara period, which had proven ineffective and costly, these provincial forces were composed of professional fighters who maintained their own equipment and horses. They developed a personal loyalty to their immediate commanders rather than abstract imperial authority, creating the foundation for the complex web of personal relationships that would define samurai culture. The northern frontier provided the crucible in which this emerging warrior ethos was forged. The campaigns against the Emishi peoples of northern Honshu, which stretched intermittently from the late 8th through the early 11th centuries, served as both training ground and proving ground for provincial warriors. The Emishi, skilled horsemen and archers who had successfully resisted imperial expansion for centuries, employed guerrilla tactics that rendered traditional Chinese military strategies obsolete. Fighting them required individual initiative, superior horsemanship, and deadly accuracy with the bow, skills that became hallmarks of samurai martial culture. These frontier conflicts were brutal affairs that bore little resemblance to the ceremonial warfare depicted in court literature. Warriors faced enemies who knew the terrain intimately and struck without warning from dense forests and mountain passes. Survival depended on personal skill rather than unit discipline, and success brought tangible rewards in the form of land grants and court appointments. The psychological impact of this frontier warfare cannot be overstated. It created a warrior mentality that valued practical effectiveness over theoretical knowledge and personal honour over bureaucratic rank. The most successful military commanders of this period began to attract followers from across the eastern provinces. These leaders offered protection, opportunity for advancement, and a share in the spoils of victory. In return, they demanded absolute loyalty and military service. This relationship, fundamentally different from the impersonal bureaucratic structures of the Heian court, created tightly knit military bands bound together by personal oaths and shared danger. The Minamoto and Taira clans emerged as the most powerful of these military families, both tracing their origins to imperial princes who had been granted surnames and sent to the provinces to establish their own fortunes. The Minamoto, also known as the Genji, descended from Emperor Seiwa and established their primary base in the Kanto region of eastern Japan. The Taira, or Heike, claimed descent from Emperor Kamu and initially concentrated their power in the western provinces before expanding eastward. These genealogical claims to imperial blood were crucial to the legitimacy of both clans. In a society where bloodline determined social status, the ability to trace one's ancestry to an emperor provided justification for wielding power that might otherwise be considered rebellious. However, these imperial connections were often distant and sometimes fabricated, serving more as political tools than accurate historical records. What mattered was not the veracity of these claims, but their acceptance by followers and rivals. The Minamoto built their power through careful cultivation of relationships with local landowners and Buddhist monasteries throughout the Kanto plain. They established a network of fortified compounds that served as both administrative centres and military strongholds. These facilities, typically constructed on elevated ground with commanding views of the surrounding countryside, featured wooden palisades, watchtowers, and storehouses for weapons and provisions. The main residence, built in the Shinden-zukuri style adapted for defensive purposes, housed the clan leader's family and provided meeting space for his retainers. The Taira pursued a different strategy, focusing on maritime trade and maintaining closer ties to the imperial court. Their base at Itsukushima, with its famous floating torii gate, symbolized their connection to both military power and religious authority. The Taira fleet controlled the inland sea, Japan's most important commercial waterway, generating enormous wealth that funded their military expansion and court influence. This maritime focus gave them advantages in mobility and logistics that their land-based rivals initially struggled to match. The weapons and armour that distinguished these warrior bands from court soldiers evolved through practical experience rather than theoretical design. The primary weapon was the asymmetrical longbow, crafted from bamboo and wood in a composite construction that provided both flexibility and power. These bows, measuring over 2 meters in length, could accurately deliver arrows at ranges exceeding 200 meters. The arrows themselves were carefully crafted projectiles with specialized points designed for different purposes: bodkin points for penetrating armor, broadheads for unarmored targets, and fire arrows for siege warfare. Mounted archery became the signature combat technique of the emerging samurai class. Warriors trained from childhood to shoot accurately while controlling their horses with their knees and reins, a skill that required years of practice to master. The ideal samurai horse was a sturdy animal, typically standing 13 to 14 hands high, bred for endurance and responsiveness rather than size. These horses, smaller than their continental counterparts, were perfectly suited to Japan's mountainous terrain and could navigate narrow mountain paths while carrying a fully equipped warrior. The armour of this period reflected both practical needs and aesthetic preferences. Early samurai armour, known as yoroi, consisted of small iron or leather plates laced together with silk cords and lacquered for weather protection. The distinctive box-like chest piece provided excellent protection against arrows while allowing sufficient mobility for mounted combat. The helmet, or kabuto, featured a neck guard and face mask designed to deflect strikes while maintaining visibility. The entire ensemble, weighing approximately 25 kilograms, was designed to be worn for extended periods during long campaigns. Sword technology during this period was undergoing significant development. The curved single-edged blade that would become synonymous with the samurai was still evolving from earlier straight-bladed designs influenced by Chinese models. Master swordsmiths began developing the differential hardening techniques that created blades with hard cutting edges and flexible spines, capable of maintaining their sharpness through extended combat while resisting breakage. These early swords, though not yet the artistic masterpieces of later periods, represented significant advances in metallurgy and craftsmanship. The tactical doctrine that emerged from frontier warfare emphasized individual prowess within a framework of coordinated action. Warriors would advance in loose formation, seeking opportunities to engage in single combat while maintaining awareness of their comrades' positions. The ideal engagement began with an exchange of arrows at long range, followed by mounted charges with spears or swords if the enemy closed distance. This approach required extensive training and mutual trust among unit members, fostering the tight bonds that characterize samurai military organizations. Training regimens for young warriors included not only weapons practice but also horsemanship, swimming, and various forms of physical conditioning. Mental preparation was equally important, involving meditation practices derived from Buddhist and Shinto traditions that emphasized mental clarity and emotional control under stress. These practices, initially pragmatic responses to the demands of warfare, gradually developed into elaborate philosophical systems that would define samurai culture for centuries. The economic foundation of this emerging warrior class rested on control of agricultural land and the peasants who worked it. Unlike European feudalism, where land ownership was typically granted by a superior lord, Japanese warriors often acquired their holdings through conquest, marriage, or direct cultivation of previously unused land. This created a more entrepreneurial approach to wealth accumulation and a stronger connection between military service and economic reward. The relationship between these provincial warriors and the imperial court remained complex and often contradictory throughout this formative period. Warriors needed court recognition to legitimize their local authority, while the court required military force to maintain its theoretical control over the provinces. This mutual dependence created opportunities for ambitious military leaders to gain influence at court while maintaining their regional power bases. Religious institutions played a crucial role in the development of samurai culture during this period. Buddhist monasteries provided education, medical care, and sometimes military training for young warriors. Shinto shrines offered spiritual protection and served as neutral meeting grounds for rival clans. The syncretic religious practices that emerged from this interaction would profoundly influence samurai values and behavior patterns. The gradual militarization of Japanese society during the late Heian period created new social categories and relationships that challenged traditional court hierarchies. Provincial warriors began to see themselves as a distinct class with its own values and traditions, separate from both the refined court nobility and the agricultural peasantry. This emerging identity would crystallize during the conflicts of the late 12th century, setting the stage for the establishment of Japan's first military government. By the mid-12th century, the provincial warrior families that had emerged during the Heian period found themselves increasingly drawn into the political machinations of the imperial court. The court nobility, despite their cultural refinement and administrative expertise, had become militarily impotent and relied entirely on these armed provincial clans to resolve disputes that their elaborate bureaucratic procedures could not address. This dependence would prove catastrophic for the traditional order, as it gave ambitious military leaders direct access to the highest levels of government and intimate knowledge of court politics. The first major indication that warriors had become indispensable to court politics came during the Shogun Rebellion of 1156. Emperor Toba's death triggered a succession dispute between his son, the retired Emperor Sutoku, and his younger son, Emperor Go-Shirakawa. Both sides recruited military support from the Minamoto and Taira clans, marking the first time that samurai armies fought within the capital itself. The conflict demonstrated the complete military helplessness of the court nobility, who watched from their palace compounds as armed horsemen decided their political fate through combat in the streets of Kyoto. The Taira leader Taira no Kiyomori aligned himself with Emperor Go-Shirakawa, while a faction of the Minamoto supported the rival claimant. The decisive battle occurred at the Shirakawa Palace, where Minamoto no Tometomo's exceptional archery skills became legendary. Contemporary accounts describe arrows that could penetrate multiple layers of armour and supposedly sink small boats with single shots. However, superior tactics and coordination gave victory to Kiyomori's forces, who surrounded the palace and set it ablaze, forcing their enemies to fight in the open where numerical superiority proved decisive. The aftermath of the Shogun Rebellion established dangerous precedents that would reshape Japanese governance. For the first time, members of the imperial family were executed for political crimes, shattering the traditional taboo against harming those of imperial blood. More significantly, the victorious warriors received substantial rewards in the form of court appointments and land grants, demonstrating that military service could provide rapid advancement that would take generations to achieve through traditional bureaucratic channels. 3 years later, the Heiji Rebellion of 1159 further accelerated the militarization of court politics. Minamoto no Yoshitomo, seeking to recover his clan's position after their defeat in the Hogan conflict, allied with the ambitious court official Fujiwara no Nobuyori in an attempt to eliminate Taira influence. Their conspiracy began with the kidnapping of Emperor Nijo and the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa during Kiyomori's absence from the capital on a pilgrimage to Kumano. The rebels initially achieved complete surprise, seizing control of the imperial palace and key government buildings throughout Kyoto. However, their failure to immediately eliminate their primary target proved fatal. Kiyomori, informed of the coup while travelling, managed to return to the capital with a substantial force and began systematically recapturing strategic positions. The decisive engagement occurred at the Rokuhara district, where the Taira had established their primary compound. Yoshitomo's forces, despite fighting with desperate courage, were overwhelmed by superior numbers and Kiyomori's tactical acumen. The defeat of the Minamoto in the Heiji Rebellion seemed to establish Taira dominance permanently. Kiyomori executed most of the adult male members of the rival clan, sparing only Yoshitomo's youngest sons due to their age. This decision, influenced by Buddhist concepts of mercy and the intervention of Kiyomori's stepmother, would prove strategically disastrous. The three surviving boys, Yoritomo, Noriyori, and Yoshitsune, were sent into exile in different regions, where they would spend the next 20 years building the network of relationships that would eventually destroy Taira power. Kiyomori's victory in 1160 marked the beginning of unprecedented military influence over imperial government. Unlike previous warrior leaders who had remained in their provincial strongholds after providing military service, Kiyomori established permanent residence in Kyoto and systematically infiltrated court hierarchy. He arranged marriages between his daughters and members of the imperial family, secured high court ranks for his sons and relatives, and gradually replaced traditional court officials with Taira appointees. The Taira leader's approach to governance represented a fundamental departure from established patterns. Rather than maintaining the traditional separation between court and military affairs, he created a hybrid system that combined warrior efficiency with court legitimacy. Taira administrators, trained in both martial arts and bureaucratic procedures, could enforce imperial decrees through military force while maintaining the ceremonial forms that gave government actions legal validity. This integration of military and civilian authority generated enormous wealth for the Taira clan. Control of key court positions provided access to tax revenues from across Japan, while their maritime expertise allowed them to dominate trade with Song China. The Taira fleet, operating from bases throughout the inland sea, collected customs duties, transported goods, and provided protection services that generated profits far exceeding traditional agricultural income. Contemporary records indicate that Taira wealth during this period surpassed that of many provincial governors and rivaled the resources of major Buddhist monasteries. However, Kiyomori's success also created the conditions for eventual Taira downfall. His clan's rapid accumulation of court positions and economic privileges generated resentment among both traditional nobility and rival warrior families. The Taira began to adopt the refined lifestyle of court aristocrats, losing the martial edge that had brought them to power while simultaneously alienating potential military allies through their exclusionary policies. The situation deteriorated further when Kiyomori attempted to manipulate imperial succession to place his infant grandson on the throne. This unprecedented assertion of military control over the imperial institution violated fundamental principles of Japanese governance and provided his enemies with powerful propaganda weapons. Even supporters began to question whether the Taira had abandoned their warrior identity in pursuit of court luxury and political power. By 1180, opposition to Taira rule had coalesced around Prince Mochihito, son of the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa. The prince's call for armed resistance against Kiyomori's government provided the legal justification that provincial warriors needed to justify rebellion against the established order. More importantly, the uprising offered an opportunity for the exiled Minamoto survivors to reclaim their ancestral position and avenge their clan's earlier defeats. Minamoto no Yoritomo, who had spent 2 decades in exile in the Izu Peninsula under the supervision of the Hojo family, received Prince Mochihito's call to arms in the 8th month of 1180. His response demonstrated the strategic acumen that would characterize his entire career. Rather than immediately launching a desperate assault against superior Taira forces, Yoritomo began methodically building a coalition of eastern warriors who shared grievances against Kiyomori's government. The Genpei War began with Yoritomo's uprising at Yamakita in Sagami Province. His initial force consisted of fewer than 300 mounted warriors, primarily drawn from his Hojo relatives and their immediate retainers. This modest beginning reflected the careful calculation that would distinguish Yoritomo's strategy throughout the conflict. Unlike previous rebellions that relied on dramatic gestures and rapid victories, he planned a methodical campaign that would gradually expand his power base while avoiding premature confrontations with superior enemy forces. The first major engagement occurred at the Battle of Ishibashiyama, where Yoritomo's small army encountered a much larger Taira force under Oba Kagechika. The battle demonstrated both the tactical sophistication of late Heian warfare and the importance of intelligence networks in determining outcomes. Fighting in mountainous terrain during a heavy rainstorm, both sides struggled with visibility and communication problems that fragmented their formations into numerous small unit actions. The Minamoto forces, despite fighting with desperate courage, were overwhelmed by superior numbers and forced to retreat into the dense forests of the Hakone Mountains. Yoritomo himself narrowly escaped capture, hiding in a hollow tree while Taira search parties passed within meters of his position. This near disaster taught him valuable lessons about the limitations of conventional warfare and the importance of maintaining secure base areas that could provide refuge during temporary setbacks. Rather than attempting to rebuild his shattered army immediately, Yoritomo crossed to the AWA province on the Boso Peninsula, where he began the patient work of coalition building that would ultimately bring him victory. His approach differed fundamentally from traditional warrior leadership patterns. Instead of demanding immediate military service based on personal loyalty or feudal obligation, he offered potential allies concrete benefits in the form of land grants, court appointments, and protection from Taira retaliation. The Kanto region proved receptive to Yoritomo's message for several specific reasons that reflected broader tensions within Heian society. Many local warrior families had been excluded from the benefits of Taira rule despite their military service during earlier conflicts. The concentration of court positions and economic privileges within Kiyomori's immediate family had created a growing class of ambitious but frustrated provincial leaders who saw rebellion as their only path to advancement. Additionally, the Taira government's increasing reliance on Chinese trade and court ceremony had alienated traditional warrior values that emphasized martial prowess and personal honor. Many Eastern warriors viewed Kiyomori's adoption of court customs as a betrayal of samurai principles and worried that continued Taira dominance would eliminate opportunities for military advancement entirely. Yoritomo's success in attracting followers also reflected his sophisticated understanding of the economic and social changes that were transforming Japanese society. The growth of agricultural surplus and commercial activity had created new forms of wealth that existed outside traditional court hierarchies. Local strongmen who controlled these resources needed legal recognition and protection from arbitrary taxation or confiscation. By offering to formalize their positions within a military government structure, Yoritomo provided solutions to practical problems that the existing court system could not address. The transformation of Yoritomo's movement from desperate rebellion to serious military threat occurred with remarkable speed during the autumn of 1180. Within 2 months of his defeat at Ishibashiyama, he had established a fortified headquarters at Kamakura and assembled an army of over 20,000 mounted warriors. This rapid expansion reflected both his personal charisma and the depth of anti-Taira sentiment throughout the eastern provinces. Kamakura's selection as Yoritomo's capital demonstrated strategic thinking that would characterize his entire approach to governance. The location, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides and facing Sagami Bay to the south, provided natural defensive advantages that would be difficult for enemies to overcome. The site also offered symbolic benefits, as it had been the stronghold of an earlier Minamoto ancestor, Minamoto no Yorinobu, connecting Yoritomo's rebellion to his clan's historical claims to leadership in the Kanto region. The establishment of the Kamakura headquarters marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict. Rather than simply seeking to replace Taira officials with Minamoto appointees within the existing court system, Yoritomo began creating parallel governmental institutions that operated independently of Kyoto's authority. He appointed his own provincial governors, established courts to resolve disputes among his followers, and created administrative systems to manage the territories under his control. This governmental experimentation attracted attention from warrior families throughout Japan who had grown frustrated with the limitations of court-based advancement systems. The Minamoto offered merit-based promotion, direct access to leadership, and the opportunity to participate in creating new institutional structures. These incentives proved particularly attractive to younger sons of established families who faced limited prospects under traditional inheritance patterns. Meanwhile, Kiyomori's response to the growing rebellion revealed the strategic weaknesses that would ultimately doom Taira rule. Rather than immediately mobilizing the full resources of his government to crush the uprising, he initially treated it as a minor provincial disturbance that could be resolved through conventional police action. This miscalculation allowed Yoritomo crucial time to consolidate his position and attract additional supporters. When Kiyomori finally recognized the seriousness of the threat, his military response was hampered by the very success that had brought the Taira to power. 2 decades of court life had softened many Taira warriors and separated them from the harsh realities of provincial warfare. Their equipment, tactics, and leadership had become oriented towards ceremonial functions rather than practical combat effectiveness. More fundamentally, the Taira faced a strategic dilemma that would plague them throughout the conflict. Their power base remained concentrated in western Japan and the Inland Sea region, while the rebellion had gained control of the economically vital Kanto plain. Any attempt to suppress the uprising required extended campaigns in unfamiliar territory against enemies who enjoyed local support and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The first major Taira offensive against Yoritomo's stronghold began in early 1181 under the command of Taira no Koremori. The expedition demonstrated both the continued military potential of the Taira and the tactical advantages that defensive positions provided to determine defenders. Koremori's army, estimated at over 70,000 men, represented one of the largest military forces assembled in Japan during the Heian period. However, the campaign quickly encountered logistical problems that would characterize much of the Genpei War. Supplying such a large force during winter months proved extremely difficult, particularly when operating in territory where the local population supported the enemy. Minamoto guerrilla attacks on supply convoys and the systematic destruction of food stores forced Koremori to divide his army into smaller, more vulnerable units. The decisive engagement occurred at the Fujikawa, where Minamoto forces under Yoritomo's brother Yoshitsune achieved complete tactical surprise. The battle began before dawn when Yoshitsune's cavalry charged through a flock of waterfowl roosting near the Taira camp. The sudden noise of thousands of birds taking flight created panic among the Taira forces, who mistook the sound for a massive enemy attack. In the confusion that followed, much of Koremori's army fled without offering serious resistance. The Battle of Fujikawa marked the beginning of Minamoto's strategic superiority that would characterize the remainder of the war. Yoritomo's forces had demonstrated their ability not only to defend their territorial base, but to defeat major Taira offensives through superior tactics and local knowledge. More importantly, the victory established the Minamoto reputation for military effectiveness that would attract additional supporters and demoralize potential enemies. The establishment of Yoritomo's military government at Kamakura represented more than a simple change of leadership. It marked the beginning of a revolutionary transformation in Japanese governance that would endure for nearly 7 centuries. However, the death of the first shogun in 1199 created an immediate succession crisis that threatened to destroy the nascent warrior government before it could fully consolidate its authority. Yoritomo's eldest son, Minamoto no Yorei, inherited the shogunal title at age 17, but lacked both his father's political acumen and the personal relationships that had held the Eastern warrior coalition together. The Hojo family, who had served as Yoritomo's most trusted advisors and whose daughter Masako had married the shogun, moved quickly to preserve the Kamakura system while securing their own position within it. Hojo no Tokimasa, Masako's father, assumed the newly created position of shiken, or regent, effectively controlling governmental functions while maintaining the fiction of Minamoto rule. This arrangement reflected the complex legitimacy requirements of medieval Japanese politics, where actual power often operated through layers of delegation and ceremonial authority. The Hojo regency faced immediate challenges from rival warrior families who had expected greater rewards for their service during the Genpei War. The Wada family, who controlled significant military forces in the Kanto region, openly questioned whether the Hojo possessed sufficient martial credentials to lead the warrior government. These tensions erupted into open conflict during the Kenin Rebellion of 1203, when Yori attempted to assert direct control over military appointments and land grants. The rebellion revealed the fundamental instability that plagued early Kamakura governance. Yori's supporters included many of the most accomplished military commanders from the Genpei War, men who had earned their position through battlefield prowess rather than administrative skill. However, their individual martial excellence could not compensate for the Hojo family's superior understanding of governmental mechanics and their careful cultivation of institutional loyalty among mid-level officials. The decisive confrontation occurred not through dramatic battlefield encounters, but through a series of political maneuvers that isolated Yori from his power base. Tokimasa systematically transferred key military commands to Hojo allies, while simultaneously spreading rumours about the young shogun's mental stability and fitness for leadership. When Yori finally attempted to mobilize forces against the regency, he discovered that most of his nominal supporters had already switched sides or adopted positions of cautious neutrality. Yori's assassination in 1204 eliminated the last serious challenge to Hojo dominance within the Kamakura government. His younger brother, Sanetomo, proved more amenable to regent control and focused his energies on poetry and court ceremony rather than military affairs. This arrangement suited Hojo interests perfectly, as it allowed them to exercise real authority while maintaining the symbolic legitimacy that Minamoto bloodline provided to their warrior government. The consolidation of Hojo power coincided with the development of sophisticated administrative systems that would define Kamakura governance for over a century. Unlike the Heian court's reliance on Chinese bureaucratic models, the warrior government created pragmatic institutions designed to address specific problems facing the military class. The most significant of these innovations was the Mandakoro, or administrative board, which handled financial matters, land disputes, and personnel appointments with remarkable efficiency. The creation of the Joi Shikimoku in 1232 represented the culmination of this institutional development. This legal code, consisting of 51 articles, established standardized procedures for resolving disputes among warriors while preserving local customs and practices that varied across different regions. Unlike earlier Japanese legal codes that attempted to impose uniform Chinese-derived regulations throughout the country, the Joi Shikimoku recognized the diversity of local conditions and provided flexible frameworks for addressing them. The code's approach to land tenure reflected the practical realities of warrior society rather than theoretical legal principles. It recognized that military service created legitimate claims to landed rewards, but also acknowledged that excessive fragmentation of holdings could undermine the economic foundation of the warrior class. The provisions regarding inheritance attempted to balance individual rights with collective security needs, allowing for division of property while maintaining minimum holdings necessary to support mounted warriors. Criminal law under the Jōei Shikimoku emphasized restitution and practical deterrence rather than abstract concepts of justice. Punishments were designed to compensate victims and prevent future offences while preserving the military potential of the warrior class. Capital punishment was reserved for the most serious crimes, reflecting both Buddhist influences and the practical consideration that executing trained warriors reduced the government's military capabilities. The administrative efficiency of the Hojo system became particularly evident in its handling of the complex land tenure arrangements that had developed during the late Heian period. The proliferation of private estates, tax exemptions, and overlapping jurisdictions had created a legal nightmare that the imperial court had been unable to resolve. Kamakura officials, working with detailed surveys and standardized procedures, systematically clarified property rights and eliminated many of the contradictions that had paralyzed earlier attempts at land reform. This administrative competence attracted support from warrior families throughout Japan, who had grown frustrated with the arbitrary and inefficient procedures of the imperial court. The Kamakura government offered predictable legal processes, merit-based advancement opportunities, and protection from the capricious demands of court nobles. These practical benefits proved more attractive to most warriors than the ceremonial honours and cultural prestige that the Kyoto court could provide. However, the success of Hojo governance also created new problems that would eventually threaten the stability of the entire system. The concentration of administrative power within a single family generated resentment among other warrior clans who felt excluded from meaningful participation in government. The Hojo response to these concerns involved creating additional layers of bureaucracy and expanding the number of official positions, but these measures failed to address the fundamental issue of power distribution. The economic prosperity that characterized much of the early Kamakura period masked underlying structural problems that would become acute during times of crisis. The warrior government's financial system depended heavily on agricultural taxation and fees collected from land transactions. This revenue base proved adequate during periods of peace and normal harvests, but lacked the flexibility needed to address extraordinary expenses such as large-scale military campaigns. The first serious test of this financial system came with the Mongol invasions of the late 13th century. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan after the Mongol conquest of Song China, had unified the Chinese mainland and Korean peninsula under a single imperial authority for the first time in centuries. This consolidation created unprecedented military and economic resources that enabled the Mongols to contemplate overseas expansion on a scale that no previous Chinese dynasty had attempted. Kublai Khan's initial diplomatic overtures to Japan in 1268 reflected standard Mongol practices for incorporating new territories into their empire. The Khan's letter, delivered through Korean intermediaries, demanded Japanese acknowledgement of Mongol suzerainty and the payment of tribute in exchange for protection and trading privileges. The language of the communication, while following diplomatic conventions, contained implicit threats that made clear the consequences of rejection. The Hojo regent Tokimune's decision to ignore these diplomatic initiatives represented a fundamental miscalculation of Mongol capabilities and intentions. Japanese leaders, isolated by geography and lacking recent experience with continental warfare, failed to comprehend the scale of military resources that the Yuan dynasty could deploy against them. Their confidence was based largely on successful resistance to earlier Chinese and Korean invasions during the 7th century, conflicts that bore little resemblance to the coordinated assault that Kublai Khan was planning. The first Mongol invasion fleet departed from Korean ports in November 1274, with approximately 900 vessels carrying 23,000 Mongol and Korean troops, along with their horses, siege equipment, and supplies for an extended campaign. This armada represented the largest amphibious assault attempted in East Asian waters up to that time, requiring months of preparation and the mobilization of resources from across the Mongol Empire. The invasion force initially targeted Tsushima and Iki Islands, which served as stepping stones between Korea and Kyushu. The defenders of these remote outposts, numbering fewer than 200 warriors total, fought with desperate courage, but were quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers and unfamiliar weapons. The Mongol forces employed Chinese-manufactured crossbows, explosive bombs, and coordinated infantry tactics that proved devastatingly effective against traditional Japanese mounted archery. The main Mongol landing occurred at Hakata Bay on the northwestern coast of Kyushu, where local Kyushu warriors had assembled to resist the invasion. The Japanese defenders, led by members of the Shimazu, Otomo, and Kikuchi families, numbered approximately 10,000 mounted warriors supported by Ashigaru foot soldiers and local militia units. Their tactical approach reflected centuries of experience in individual combat and small unit actions, but proved inadequate against the disciplined formations and coordinated tactics employed by the invaders. The Battle of Hakata Bay exposed fundamental weaknesses in traditional samurai warfare that would force comprehensive tactical reforms during subsequent decades. Japanese warriors approached combat as a series of individual duels between mounted opponents, beginning with formal challenges and exchanges of arrows before closing to sword range. This approach, suitable for conflicts between warrior bands with similar training and equipment, proved suicidal against enemies who fought as coordinated units and ignored traditional combat etiquette. Mongol military doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower delivered through massed archery, followed by coordinated charges designed to break enemy formations rather than engage in individual combat. Their composite bows, manufactured according to standardized specifications, possessed greater range and penetrating power than Japanese weapons. More importantly, Mongol archers were trained to shoot in volleys that created killing zones rather than seeking individual targets, maximizing the psychological impact of their attacks. The explosive bombs employed by the Mongol forces represented a technological innovation that Japanese defenders had never encountered. These ceramic containers, filled with gunpowder and metal fragments, were designed to create panic among enemy horses and disrupt cavalry formations. Contemporary Japanese accounts describe the terrifying noise and destructive effects of these weapons, which seemed to violate natural laws and suggested supernatural intervention on behalf of the invaders. Despite these technological and tactical disadvantages, the Japanese defenders inflicted significant casualties on the Mongol forces through desperate courage and intimate knowledge of local terrain. Fighting in the narrow coastal plain between Hakata Bay and the mountains of interior Kyushu, they used hit-and-run tactics and nighttime raids to harass enemy supply lines and prevent the invaders from establishing secure base camps. The withdrawal of the Mongol fleet after only 2 days of fighting resulted from a combination of factors that included both military setbacks and environmental challenges. The invasion force had expected to achieve rapid victory through superior tactics and equipment, but encountered more determined resistance than anticipated. Additionally, seasonal weather patterns in the Korea Strait made extended naval operations extremely hazardous, particularly for heavily loaded transport vessels operating close to unfamiliar coastlines. The famous typhoon that allegedly destroyed much of the Mongol fleet during its withdrawal appears to have been a later embellishment of actual events. Contemporary records suggest that stormy weather did cause some ship losses, but the primary factor in the invasion's failure was the inability to establish secure beachheads and supply lines necessary for sustained operations. The Mongol commanders, experienced in continental warfare, underestimated the logistical challenges involved in amphibious operations against a defended coastline. The aftermath of the first invasion attempt created a crisis of confidence within the Kamakura government that would have lasting consequences for the warrior class. The Hojo Regency had successfully organised the defence of Kyushu, but the cost of mobilising forces from across Japan and maintaining them in a state of readiness strained the government's financial resources. More problematically, the traditional system of rewarding military service through land grants proved impossible to implement, since the defenders had been protecting existing territories rather than conquering new ones. This inability to provide tangible rewards for military service violated fundamental expectations of the warrior class and created widespread resentment among families who had incurred significant expenses preparing for and participating in the defence. Many warriors had sold property or borrowed money to equip themselves and their followers for the campaign, expecting to recoup these investments through the distribution of conquered lands. The absence of such rewards left them in worse financial condition than before the invasion. The Hojo response to these complaints involved creating new administrative positions and honorary titles, but these measures failed to address the underlying economic problems facing the warrior class. The increasing monetization of the Japanese economy during the late Kamakura period had created new forms of wealth and expense that the traditional land-based reward system could not accommodate. Warriors needed cash to purchase imported weapons and equipment, but the government lacked mechanisms for generating and distributing monetary rewards. Kublai Khan's decision to launch a second invasion attempt reflected both his determination to complete the conquest of Japan and his confidence that the lessons learned from the first campaign would ensure success. The Yuan dynasty had spent 6 years preparing for this assault, constructing new vessels specifically designed for amphibious operations and assembling forces from across the Mongol Empire. The scale of preparation dwarfed that of the earlier invasion and represented one of the largest military undertakings in medieval history. The second invasion fleet, departing in 1281, consisted of 2 separate armadas that were intended to converge on Kyushu from different directions. The Eastern Route Army, launching from Korean ports, included approximately 40,000 Mongol, Korean and northern Chinese troops transported in 900 vessels. The Southern Route Army, departing from ports in southern China, carried 100,000 troops, primarily former Song Chinese soldiers, in over 3,500 ships of various sizes. This massive undertaking required unprecedented coordination between different regions of the Mongol Empire and demonstrated the administrative capabilities that had enabled the Yuan dynasty to govern the world's largest contiguous empire. The logistics of assembling, equipping and transporting such enormous forces across hundreds of miles of ocean represented achievements in military organisation that would not be surpassed until the modern era. The Japanese response to this second invasion attempt revealed significant improvements in both defensive preparations and tactical doctrine. The Kamakura government had used the intervening years to construct fortifications along the Kyushu coastline, including a stone wall that extended for several kilometres along Hakata Bay. This barrier, built through the mobilization of labour from across western Japan, represented a fundamental shift from the mobile defence tactics that had characterised the first invasion. More importantly, Japanese warriors had adapted their fighting methods to address the tactical challenges revealed during the earlier conflict. They abandoned the individual combat techniques that had proved ineffective against coordinated enemy formations and developed new approaches that emphasised coordinated unit actions and the use of terrain to offset enemy advantages in equipment and numbers. The successful defence against the second Mongol invasion had exhausted the Kamakura government's financial reserves and exposed fundamental weaknesses in its reward system that would prove impossible to resolve. By the early 14th century, The Hojo Regency faced mounting pressure from warrior families who had received neither compensation for their military service nor adequate protection from the economic hardships that plagued much of Japan. The increasing monetization of the economy had created new forms of debt and financial obligation that the traditional land-based governance system could not address effectively. Emperor Go-Daigo's accession to the throne in 1318 coincided with this growing crisis of warrior confidence in the Kamakura system. Unlike his predecessors, who had accepted their ceremonial role within the dual structure of imperial and military authority, Go-Daigo possessed genuine political ambitions and a sophisticated understanding of the weaknesses that plagued the Hojo government. His court attracted disaffected warriors, ambitious court nobles, and Buddhist monks who shared grievances against the established order. The emperor's initial attempts at direct rule, known as the Kenmu Restoration, began with careful preparation and coalition building that demonstrated considerable political acumen. Go-Daigo recognized that successful rebellion required more than imperial legitimacy. It needed military force capable of defeating the professional warriors who served the Kamakura government. His recruitment efforts focused on warrior families who'd been excluded from Hojo patronage networks, and younger sons of established clans who faced limited advancement prospects under the existing system. The Genko War erupted in 1331 when Go-Daigo's conspiracy was discovered by Kamakura intelligence networks. The emperor's flight to Mount Kasagi, where he established a fortified position defended by warrior monks from nearby Enryaku-ji Temple, marked the beginning of a conflict that would fundamentally transform Japanese political structures. The mountain stronghold, protected by steep approaches and dense forests, provided an ideal base for the guerrilla warfare tactics that would characterize much of the subsequent fighting. The Hojo response to this imperial rebellion revealed the extent to which their military capabilities had deteriorated during the peaceful decades following the Mongol invasions. The warrior families who had once provided reliable military service had become increasingly independent and were reluctant to commit substantial resources to campaigns that offered little prospect of material reward. Many regional strongmen adopted positions of cautious neutrality, waiting to see which side would emerge victorious before committing their forces. The siege of Mount Kasagi demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of traditional Japanese siege warfare. The attacking forces led by Hojo loyalists possessed overwhelming numerical superiority but lacked the specialized equipment and techniques necessary for reducing fortified positions. Their attempts to storm the mountain defences resulted in heavy casualties and minimal territorial gains, while the defenders used their elevated positions and knowledge of local terrain to inflict disproportionate losses on the attackers. The capture of Emperor Go-Daigo in 1332, achieved through treachery rather than military assault, appeared to end the rebellion and restore Hojo authority. However, the emperor's subsequent exile to the Oki Islands created a powerful symbol of resistance that attracted additional supporters to the imperial cause. More significantly, his absence from the capital allowed ambitious military commanders to claim they were acting in his name while pursuing their own territorial and political objectives. Kusunoki Masashige emerged during this period as the most innovative and effective of the imperial military commanders. Operating from fortified positions in the mountainous regions south of Kyoto, he developed tactical approaches that maximized the advantages of defensive terrain while minimizing the impact of enemy numerical superiority. His fortress at Chihaya, constructed on a steep hillside with carefully prepared killing zones and concealed positions, became a model for defensive architecture that would influence Japanese military engineering for centuries. The siege of Chihaya in 1333 exposed the tactical obsolescence of traditional Kamakura military doctrine. The attacking forces, employing conventional approaches that emphasized mounted charges and individual combat, found themselves unable to make meaningful progress against defenders who used coordinated archery, concealed positions, and carefully timed counterattacks. Masashige's forces employed deception, night raids, and psychological warfare to demoralize their enemies and create an impression of supernatural intervention on behalf of the imperial cause. The defection of Ashikaga Takauji represented the decisive turning point in the Genko War and the beginning of the end for Kamakura authority. Takauji, a member of a cadet branch of the Minamoto clan, had initially served the Hojo government loyally and commanded significant military forces in the eastern provinces. His decision to join the imperial cause reflected both personal ambition and a calculated assessment that the Kamakura system could no longer provide effective governance or adequate rewards for military service. Takauji's switch of allegiance triggered a cascade of defections that rapidly undermined Hojo military capabilities throughout Japan. Regional strongmen who had been waiting for a clear indication of which side would prevail began declaring for the imperial cause, bringing with them substantial military forces and control over strategic territories. The speed of this collapse demonstrated that Hojo authority had been maintained more through habit and tradition than through genuine loyalty or effective governance. The fall of Kamakura in 1333 marked the end of the first warrior government and the beginning of a complex period of political experimentation that would last for over 2 centuries. The destruction of the Hojo stronghold involved systematic burning of government buildings, temples, and residential compounds that had housed the warrior elite for nearly 150 years. Contemporary accounts describe the smoke from these fires as visible from distances of over 30 kilometers, symbolizing the complete elimination of the old order. Emperor Go-Daigo's return to Kyoto and the establishment of direct imperial rule initially appeared to fulfill the goals of the anti-Kamakura coalition. However, the emperor's vision of centralized government based on Chinese models proved incompatible with the decentralized realities of 14th century Japan. His attempts to restore court-based administration and reduce the influence of warrior families alienated many of the military leaders who had made his victory possible. The Kenmu Restoration's failure to address the fundamental problems that had undermined the Kamakura system became apparent within months of its establishment. The emperor's government lacked both the financial resources and administrative machinery necessary to govern Japan's diverse regions effectively. More critically, Go-Daigo's emphasis on court ceremony and Chinese-inspired bureaucracy ignored the practical needs of the warrior class that had become the dominant force in Japanese society. Ashikaga Takauji's rebellion against the imperial government in 1335 reflected both personal ambition and genuine disagreement about the proper structure of Japanese governance. Takauji argued that effective rule required the participation of warrior families and the recognition of their legitimate interests in land ownership and military command. His political program, while self-serving, addressed real concerns about the sustainability of purely court-based government in a society that had been fundamentally transformed by over a century of warrior rule. The conflict between Takauji and the imperial forces led by Nitta Yoshisada created the conditions for the complex period known as Nanboku-cho, or the era of northern and southern courts. This division occurred when Go-Daigo fled Kyoto with the imperial regalia and established an alternative court in the mountainous Yoshino region south of the capital. Takauji, meanwhile, installed a rival emperor from a different branch of the imperial family and established his military headquarters in Kyoto. The existence of 2 competing imperial courts created unprecedented legitimacy problems that divided warrior families throughout Japan. Unlike previous conflicts where rival claimants represented different branches of the same political system, the northern and southern courts embodied fundamentally different approaches to governance and the relationship between imperial authority and warrior power. This ideological dimension gave the conflict an intensity and duration that purely dynastic disputes rarely achieved. The geographical distribution of support for each court reflected underlying regional differences that had been developing throughout the Kamakura period. The southern court attracted support primarily from the mountainous regions of central Japan. where warrior families had maintained greater independence from Kamakura authority and possessed strong traditions of resistance to centralized control. The northern court, backed by Ashikaga military power, dominated the plains regions and major population centers where effective governance required administrative efficiency and economic coordination. The military campaigns of the Nanboku-cho period were characterized by their extended duration and inconclusive results. Unlike the decisive battles of earlier conflicts, engagements during this era typically involved prolonged sieges, guerrilla warfare, and shifting alliances that prevented either side from achieving permanent victory. The mountainous terrain of central Japan favoured defensive tactics and made it extremely difficult for either court to eliminate its rival completely. Ashikaga Takauji's establishment of his shogunate in 1338 represented an attempt to create a new synthesis between imperial legitimacy and warrior governance. Unlike the Kamakura system, which had maintained the fiction of serving the emperor while exercising independent authority, the Ashikaga shogunate sought explicit imperial recognition for its governmental functions. This approach reflected both Takauji's political sophistication and his understanding that sustainable authority required some form of ceremonial legitimacy. The Ashikaga governmental system, centered in Kyoto rather than a separate military capital, represented a fundamental departure from Kamakura precedents. By establishing their headquarters in the imperial capital, the Ashikaga shoguns positioned themselves as partners rather than rivals of the court nobility. This arrangement created opportunities for cultural exchange and political cooperation, but also exposed the warrior government to the factional disputes and ceremonial obligations that had paralyzed earlier court-based administrations. The development of the Shugo daimyo system under Ashikaga rule reflected both practical necessity and conscious policy choices that would have profound consequences for Japanese political development. The Shugo, originally appointed as temporary provincial governors with limited authority, gradually evolved into powerful regional lords who exercised comprehensive control over their territories. This transformation occurred partly through deliberate Ashikaga policy, which granted expanded powers to loyal supporters, and partly through the practical requirements of governing during a period of continuous warfare. The Shugo daimyo differed fundamentally from earlier forms of provincial authority in both the scope of their powers and their relationship to central government. Unlike Kamakura-era governors, who had served primarily as military commanders and tax collectors, the Shugo daimyo exercised judicial, administrative, and economic functions that made them virtually independent rulers within their domains. They maintained their own armies, collected taxes, administered justice, and conducted diplomatic relations with neighbouring territories. This decentralisation of authority created a complex political landscape where effective power was distributed among dozens of regional strongmen who owed nominal allegiance to the Ashikaga shogun but pursued their own interests when those conflicted with central government policy. The shogun's authority depended on his ability to maintain a coalition of these powerful lords through a combination of rewards, threats, and diplomatic manoeuvring that required constant attention and considerable resources. The economic foundation of the Shugo daimyo system rested on their control of agricultural production and local commerce within their territories. Unlike the Kamakura system, which had relied primarily on income from specific land grants, the Shugo daimyo collected taxes from all economic activity within their domains. This comprehensive approach to revenue generation provided them with greater financial resources than earlier provincial authorities, but also required more sophisticated administrative systems to manage effectively. The development of castle towns during this period reflected both the military needs of the Shugo daimyo and the economic opportunities created by their territorial control. These fortified settlements, typically constructed around the lord's primary residence, served as administrative centres, military bases, and commercial hubs that attracted merchants, artisans, and service providers. The concentration of economic activity in these planned communities created new forms of wealth and social organization that would profoundly influence Japanese urban development. The Onin War, which erupted in 1467, represented the culmination of tensions that had been building within the Ashikaga system for over a century. The conflict originated as a succession dispute within the shogunal family, but quickly expanded to encompass broader questions about the distribution of power among the Shugo daimyo and the proper relationship between central and regional authority. The involvement of virtually every major warrior family in Japan transformed what might have been a limited dynastic conflict into a comprehensive civil war. The immediate cause of the Onin War lay in the disputed succession of Ashikaga Yoshimasa, who had failed to produce a male heir and had designated his brother Yoshimi as his successor. However, the subsequent birth of a son, Yoshihisa, created competing claims that different factions of Shugo daimyo supported for their own strategic reasons. The Hosokawa family, led by Hosokawa Katsumoto, supported Yoshimi's claim, while their rivals, the Yamana clan under Yamana Sozen, backed the infant Yoshihisa. The military campaigns of the Onin War were characterized by their destructive impact on Kyoto and the surrounding regions. Unlike earlier conflicts that had involved mobile campaigns across broad geographical areas, much of the fighting during this war occurred within the capital itself, where competing armies constructed fortifications and engaged in house-to-house combat that devastated the urban infrastructure. Contemporary accounts describe entire districts reduced to ash and rubble, with major temples and aristocratic residences suffering complete destruction. The tactical innovations that emerged during the Onin War reflected both the urban environment in which much of the fighting occurred and the changing social composition of Japanese armies. The Shugo daimyo increasingly relied on ashigaru foot soldiers rather than traditional mounted warriors, reflecting both economic considerations and the tactical requirements of siege warfare. These professional infantry units, equipped with spears, crossbows and early firearms, proved more effective than cavalry in the confined spaces and fortified positions that characterized urban combat. The introduction of firearms to Japan in 1543 by Portuguese traders represented a technological revolution that would fundamentally transform Japanese warfare during the final decades of the Ashikaga period. The first arquebus demonstrations conducted on the island of Tanegashima revealed both the potential and limitations of these new weapons. While early firearms possessed greater penetrating power than traditional bows and required less training to use effectively, they were also slow to reload, unreliable in wet weather, and produced smoke that revealed the shooter's position. Japanese craftsmen, renowned for their metallurgical skills, quickly mastered the techniques necessary to manufacture firearms domestically. Within a decade of their introduction, Japanese-made arquebuses were being produced in quantities that exceeded European manufacturing capabilities. This rapid adoption reflected both the technical sophistication of Japanese metalworkers and the urgent military needs created by the continuous warfare of the Sengoku period. The tactical implications of firearm adoption extended far beyond simple weapon substitution. The effectiveness of massed arquebus fire required new forms of military organization and training that emphasized unit coordination rather than individual prowess. Infantry formations equipped with firearms needed protection from cavalry charges and coordination with other weapon systems to maximize their effectiveness. These requirements contributed to the development of more complex military hierarchies and specialized command structures. Castle architecture underwent dramatic evolution during this period in response to both firearm technology and the changing nature of siege warfare. The traditional wooden palisades and earthwork fortifications that had characterized earlier defensive systems proved inadequate against artillery and sustained bombardment. Japanese military engineers developed sophisticated stone construction techniques that created defensive systems capable of withstanding both conventional assault and gunpowder weapons. The emergence of the Sengoku period around 1477 marked the beginning of an era of unprecedented military innovation and political fragmentation that would continue until national reunification in the late 16th century. The collapse of effective Ashikaga authority created opportunities for ambitious regional leaders to expand their territories and influence through military conquest. This competitive environment stimulated rapid development in military technology, tactical doctrine, and governmental administration, as survival depended on maintaining advantages over rivals. The collapse of centralized Ashikaga authority after the Onin War created a power vacuum that ambitious regional strongmen were quick to exploit. By 1477, Japan had fragmented into dozens of independent territories controlled by Sengoku daimyo, who owed no meaningful allegiance to the enfeebled Ashikaga shogunate in Kyoto. These warlords, emerging from various backgrounds including former Shugo families, successful military commanders, and even wealthy merchants who had purchased warrior status, shared common characteristics that distinguished them from their predecessors: ruthless pragmatism, innovative military thinking, and sophisticated understanding of economic warfare. The Sengoku daimyo revolutionized Japanese military organization through systematic professionalization of their armed forces. Unlike the traditional warrior bands that had relied on seasonal campaigns and part-time soldiers who returned to agricultural duties during planting and harvest seasons, these new military leaders maintained standing armies equipped and trained for continuous operations. The core of these forces consisted of professional Ashigaru infantry, recruited from the peasant class and provided with standardized equipment, regular pay, and intensive training in coordinated tactics. This military revolution required corresponding innovations in logistics and supply systems. The Sengoku daimyo developed sophisticated networks of supply depots, weapons manufacturers, and transportation systems that could sustain armies in the field for extended periods. They established armories within their castle towns, where skilled craftsmen produced weapons according to standardized specifications, ensuring compatibility and ease of maintenance. These manufacturing centres also served as training facilities where young warriors learned not only individual combat skills, but also the complex coordination required for effective unit operations. The economic foundation supporting these military innovations rested on comprehensive exploitation of territorial resources through improved agricultural techniques, expanded commerce, and systematic taxation. The Sengoku daimyo implemented land surveys that accurately assessed agricultural productivity, enabling them to maximize tax revenues while maintaining peasant productivity. They encouraged technological improvements such as new rice varieties, better irrigation systems, and more efficient farming tools that increased yields and supported larger populations. Oda Nobunaga emerged from this competitive environment as the most innovative and successful of the Sengoku daimyo, though his initial position hardly suggested future dominance. The Oda clan controlled only a portion of Owari province, surrounded by more powerful neighbours who initially dismissed Nobunaga as an eccentric young lord, whose unconventional behaviour violated traditional warrior customs. His tendency to wear foreign clothing, associate with merchants and foreigners, and ignore ceremonial protocols led many contemporaries to underestimate his strategic capabilities and military potential. Nobunaga's first major victory at the Battle of Okahazama in 1560 demonstrated the tactical innovations that would characterize his entire career. Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful daimyo in eastern Japan, had assembled an army of approximately 25,000 troops for a march on Kyoto that would have established Imagawa dominance over central Japan. The Imagawa forces, confident in their numerical superiority and Yoshimoto's reputation as a military commander, made camp in a narrow valley during a heavy rainstorm, assuming that the weather would prevent any serious attack. Nobunaga's response violated every conventional principle of samurai warfare. Rather than accepting the hopelessness of his situation or seeking to negotiate terms, he assembled a force of fewer than 3,000 men and launched a surprise assault during the height of the storm. His troops, moving through mountain paths that the enemy had not bothered to guard, achieved complete tactical surprise by attacking the Imagawa headquarters directly rather than engaging the main army. The assault, coordinated to coincide with a lightning strike that created additional confusion, resulted in Yoshimoto's death and the complete collapse of Imagawa authority in the region. The victory at Okahazama established Nobunaga's reputation for tactical brilliance and demonstrated his willingness to employ unconventional methods that traditional warriors found dishonourable. His use of detailed intelligence networks, careful timing, and concentration of force against enemy weak points became hallmarks of his strategic approach. More importantly, the battle revealed his understanding that decisive victory required the elimination of enemy leadership rather than the gradual attrition that characterized most contemporary conflicts. Nobunaga's subsequent campaigns against the Buddhist warrior monasteries represented perhaps his most controversial but strategically necessary actions. The great temple complexes of Mount Heian, Ishiyama Hongan-ji, and Nagoro-ji had evolved into independent military powers that controlled extensive territories and maintained armies capable of challenging secular authorities. These religious institutions, protected by their sacred status and supported by networks of affiliated temples throughout Japan, represented obstacles to centralized authority that no unification effort could ignore. The siege of Ishiyama Hongan-ji, lasting from 1570 to 1580, demonstrated both the military capabilities of Buddhist institutions and Nobunaga's determination to eliminate all independent power centers. The fortress temple, constructed on a strategic site overlooking Osaka Bay, possessed sophisticated defensive works that incorporated both traditional Japanese architecture and European-influenced artillery positions. The defending monks, supported by thousands of armed peasant believers known as Iko-iki, employed firearms, cannons, and coordinated infantry tactics that rivaled those of professional armies. Nobunaga's approach to this siege revealed his systematic method of warfare that combined military pressure with economic strangulation and psychological intimidation. His forces constructed a network of fortified positions that surrounded the temple complex, cutting off supply lines and preventing reinforcement. Simultaneously, he negotiated agreements with Portuguese traders that provided his armies with superior firearms and gunpowder while denying these resources to his enemies. The siege also featured extensive use of naval forces to control access routes through Osaka Bay, demonstrating Nobunaga's understanding of combined arms warfare. The destruction of the Enryaku-ji temple complex on Mount Hiei in 1571 shocked contemporaries through its thoroughness and apparent sacrilege. Nobunaga's forces, numbering approximately 30,000 troops, systematically burned every building within the temple grounds and killed virtually every inhabitant, including monks, servants, women, and children. This action, unprecedented in Japanese history for its scale and brutality, served multiple strategic purposes. It eliminated a military threat, demonstrated the consequences of resistance, and established Nobunaga's reputation for ruthlessness that would deter future opposition. The tactical innovations that Nobunaga introduced to Japanese warfare extended beyond mere adoption of firearms to encompass fundamental changes in military organization and battlefield doctrine. His armies employed coordinated formations of arquebusiers protected by spearmen and supported by cavalry units, trained for specific tactical roles rather than individual combat. These formations required extensive training and discipline that transformed warfare from a series of personal duels into coordinated unit actions directed by professional officers. The Battle of Nagakute in 1584, fought after Nobunaga's death, demonstrated how completely his innovations had transformed Japanese military practice. The engagement, involving forces loyal to Toyotomi Hideyoshi and those supporting Tokugawa Ieyasu, featured complex tactical maneuvers that would have been impossible with traditional warrior bands. Both armies employed coordinated infantry formations, artillery support, and cavalry charges timed to exploit enemy weaknesses created by firearm volleys. The battle's outcome depended on superior coordination and tactical flexibility rather than individual martial prowess. Nobunaga's use of professional armies rather than traditional warrior levies represented a fundamental transformation in the social basis of Japanese military power. His forces included large numbers of ashigaru recruited from the peasant class and provided with standardized equipment and regular wages. These professional soldiers, freed from agricultural obligations and trained exclusively for warfare, proved more reliable and effective than part-time warriors who divided their attention between military service and economic activities. The logistical systems that supported these professional armies required unprecedented levels of organization and resource management. Nobunaga established networks of supply depots throughout his territories, connected by improved roads that enabled rapid movement of troops and equipment. His quartermasters developed standardized procedures for provisioning armies in the field, including portable cooking equipment, preserved foods, and medical supplies that maintained fighting effectiveness during extended campaigns. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's rise from ashigaru foot soldier to supreme military commander illustrated both the social mobility possible during the Sengoku period and the importance of administrative talent in managing complex military operations. His early service under Nobunaga involved primarily logistical responsibilities, but his exceptional organizational abilities and strategic insight earned him increasing authority over military planning and execution. Following Nobunaga's death in 1582, Hideyoshi's rapid response to the crisis and his successful elimination of rivals demonstrated his mastery of both military and political warfare. The Battle of Shizugatake in 1583 established Hideyoshi's dominance over potential rivals within the former Oda coalition. Shibata Katsui, Nobunaga's most experienced general, had assembled a formidable army and occupied strong defensive positions that seemed to guarantee victory over Hideyoshi's supposedly inferior forces. However, Hideyoshi's campaign demonstrated the tactical flexibility and strategic deception that would characterize his approach to unification. His famous forced march, covering over 50 kilometers in a single day to achieve tactical surprise, enabled him to concentrate superior forces against isolated enemy positions before they could receive reinforcement. The tactical execution of Shizugatake revealed how completely Japanese warfare had evolved from its traditional patterns. Both armies employed coordinated formations of arquebusiers, spearmen, and cavalry operating according to predetermined battle plans, rather than responding to battlefield developments through individual initiative. The decisive phase involved carefully timed attacks by multiple units that created overwhelming pressure at specific points in the enemy line, forcing complete collapse rather than gradual withdrawal. Hideyoshi's continuation of Nobunaga's unification program required adaptation of military methods to address different strategic challenges. While Nobunaga had focused primarily on eliminating independent power centers within central Japan, Hideyoshi faced the more complex task of integrating diverse regional powers into a unified national system. This required not only military conquest, but also diplomatic negotiation, economic incentives, and administrative reforms that addressed the legitimate concerns of potential allies. The Siege of Odawara in 1590 demonstrated Hideyoshi's mastery of siege warfare and his ability to coordinate massive military operations involving over 200,000 troops drawn from across Japan. The Hojo clan's fortress at Odawara, constructed according to the most advanced defensive principles and supplied for extended resistance, represented the culmination of Sengoku period castle architecture. The defensive system included multiple concentric walls, sophisticated artillery positions, and underground tunnels that enabled defenders to launch surprise attacks against besieging forces. Hideyoshi's approach to this siege combined overwhelming force with innovative tactical methods that neutralized the defenders' advantages. His engineers constructed elaborate siege works that included artificial hills providing elevated firing positions, covered approaches that protected attacking forces, and diversion tunnels designed to undermine the castle's foundations. The siege also featured extensive use of naval forces to prevent supply shipments and psychological warfare designed to demoralize the defenders through demonstrations of superior resources and determination. The completion of national unification through the Odawara campaign marked a fundamental transformation in Japanese political organization that ended nearly 2 centuries of fragmented authority. Hideyoshi's distribution of the conquered Hojo territories to loyal supporters established precedents for land redistribution that would influence Tokugawa governance policies. More immediately, the campaign demonstrated that no regional power, regardless of defensive preparations or traditional autonomy, could resist the combined military resources of a unified Japan. The invasions of Korea, launched in 1592 and resumed in 1597, represented Hideyoshi's attempt to channel the military energies of the unified warrior class toward external conquest while establishing Japanese dominance over East Asian trade networks. The initial invasion force of approximately 160,000 troops constituted the largest military expedition in Japanese history up to that time, requiring unprecedented logistical coordination and strategic planning. The army included contingents from virtually every major daimyo domain, equipped with the most advanced weapons and organized according to the tactical innovations developed during the Unification Wars. The early phases of the Korean campaign revealed both the strengths and limitations of Japanese military methods when applied to continental warfare. The invasion forces achieved rapid initial success, capturing Seoul within 3 weeks and advancing deep into Korean territory through superior tactics and equipment. Japanese armies employed coordinated formations of arquebusiers and spearmen that proved devastatingly effective against Korean forces trained primarily for defensive operations against traditional enemies. However, the extended supply lines required to sustain large armies on the Korean peninsula exposed logistical weaknesses that would plague Japanese operations throughout both invasions. The transport of food, ammunition, and replacement equipment across the Korea Strait required naval resources that Japan struggled to maintain against Chinese and Korean naval opposition. The famous turtle ships developed by Admiral Yi Sun-sin, featuring iron-reinforced hulls and multiple cannon, proved particularly effective against Japanese naval forces that lacked experience in artillery duels at sea. The intervention of Chinese Ming forces fundamentally altered the strategic situation and forced Japanese commanders to adapt their tactics to address enemies employing different military traditions. Chinese armies, organized according to continental principles and equipped with artillery systems superior to Japanese weapons, required new tactical approaches that emphasized defensive positions and coordinated firearm volleys rather than the aggressive assault tactics that had proven successful during the unification campaigns. The Siege of Pyongyang in 1593 demonstrated the tactical challenges facing Japanese forces when confronted with professional Chinese armies supported by advanced artillery. The Chinese relief force, commanded by Li Rusong, employed siege guns and coordinated infantry assaults that forced Japanese defenders to abandon positions that had previously seemed impregnable. The Japanese withdrawal from Pyongyang marked the beginning of a strategic stalemate that would characterize the remainder of the Korean campaigns. The impact of the Korean invasions on Japanese military development extended far beyond immediate tactical lessons to encompass fundamental changes in strategic thinking and international relations. The campaigns exposed the limitations of Japanese naval capabilities and stimulated innovations in ship design and naval tactics that would influence maritime warfare for decades. More importantly, the experience of fighting Chinese and Korean forces provided Japanese military leaders with knowledge of continental military methods that would prove valuable in subsequent conflicts. The financial costs of sustaining large armies in Korea for over 6 years strained the resources of even the most powerful daimyo domains and contributed to economic instability that would influence domestic politics throughout the remainder of Hideyoshi's reign. The requirement to maintain forces overseas while simultaneously defending Japanese territories against potential Chinese retaliation forced military leaders to develop new approaches to resource allocation and strategic planning that balance competing priorities. The death of Hideyoshi in 1598 and the subsequent withdrawal from Korea created a power vacuum that ambitious daimyo were quick to exploit. The complex regency system, established to govern during the minority of Hideyoshi's son, proved incapable of maintaining unity among the great lords, many of whom had emerged from the Korean campaigns with enhanced military capabilities and reduced respect for central authority. The formation of competing coalitions around Tokugawa Ieyasu and Ishida Mitsunari reflected both personal ambitions and fundamental disagreements about the proper structure of Japanese governance. The Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 represented the culmination of tensions that had been building since Hideyoshi's death and established the Tokugawa clan's dominance over Japan for the next 2.5 centuries. The engagement, involving over 160,000 warriors divided between the eastern and western armies, demonstrated how completely the military innovations of the Sengoku period had transformed Japanese warfare. Both sides employed coordinated formations of firearms, artillery and cavalry, operating according to sophisticated battle plans that required extensive preparation and professional leadership to execute effectively. The establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate at Edo following Ieyasu's decisive victory at Sekigahara marked the beginning of the most profound transformation in samurai history. Unlike the Kamakura and Ashikaga systems, which had maintained the warrior class's fundamental military function while adapting to changing political circumstances, the Tokugawa regime deliberately restructured samurai society to serve the needs of centralized governance and permanent peace. This transformation began immediately after 1603, when Ieyasu received the title of shogun and initiated policies that would systematically convert Japan's warrior elite from independent military commanders into bureaucratic administrators serving a highly centralized state. The Sankin Katai system, formally codified in 1635 under the third shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu, represented the cornerstone of this transformation. The policy required all daimyo to maintain permanent residences in Edo and spend alternate years in attendance at the shogunal court, while their wives and heirs remained as permanent hostages in the capital. This arrangement served multiple strategic purposes that extended far beyond simple control mechanisms. The constant movement of daimyo retinues between their domains and Edo created a massive internal economy centered on transportation, accommodation, and luxury goods that redirected warrior spending away from military preparations towards ceremonial display and conspicuous consumption. The practical implementation of Sankin Katai required daimyo to maintain elaborate processions that could include several hundred retainers, servants and guards, depending on their domain's assessed value. These processions, strictly regulated by shogunal law regarding route selection, stopping points and ceremonial protocols, transformed Japan's road network into a carefully monitored system of control. The Tokaido, Nakasendo, and other major highways became stages for ritualized displays of submission to Tokugawa authority, where each daimyo's procession demonstrated both his wealth and his acceptance of his subordinate position within the national hierarchy. The economic burden imposed by Sankin Katai proved devastating to daimyo finances, and fundamentally altered the relationship between lords and their retainers. Maintaining dual residences, supporting large retinues in expensive Edo, and funding elaborate processions consumed enormous resources that had previously been available for military purposes. Many domains spent between 30 and 50% of their annual revenues on sankin kotai obligations, forcing them to reduce the size of their samurai retainer bands and convert military stipends into administrative salaries for a much smaller number of bureaucratic officials. This financial pressure accelerated the transformation of samurai from independent warriors into stipended retainers whose livelihoods depended entirely on their lord's continued favour and the stability of the domain administrative system. Unlike the Sengoku period, when ambitious warriors could advance through military service or by switching allegiance to more successful commanders, the Tokugawa system offered no legitimate opportunities for social mobility through martial prowess. Samurai advancement required mastery of bureaucratic skills, knowledge of legal procedures, and competence in the complex ceremonial protocols that governed interactions between different levels of the social hierarchy. The implementation of the four-class system known as Shi-no Kosho provided the ideological framework that justified this transformation while maintaining samurai privilege within a fundamentally altered social structure. This hierarchy, derived from Chinese Confucian political theory, placed samurai at the apex of society as the administrative class responsible for governance and moral leadership. Below them, farmers occupied the second position as the productive class whose agricultural labour supported the entire social system. Artisans ranked third as creators of useful goods, while merchants, despite their obvious wealth and practical importance, were relegated to the bottom as parasitic manipulators of prices who contributed nothing of intrinsic value to society. The theoretical elevation of samurai status within this system masked their practical loss of independence and military function. While Confucian ideology emphasized the warrior class's responsibility for moral cultivation and administrative competence, the actual implementation of Shi-no Kosho created rigid boundaries that prevented social mobility and trapped samurai within increasingly obsolete roles. The system's emphasis on hereditary status rather than individual merit meant that incompetent samurai retained their positions, while talented individuals from lower classes could not advance regardless of their abilities. The prohibition of weapons carrying by non-samurai, enforced through periodic sword hunts and strict registration requirements, maintained the symbolic distinction between the warrior class and the rest of society even as the practical significance of martial skills diminished. Samurai retained the exclusive right to wear two swords, the katana and wakizashi, which served as visible markers of their elevated status and theoretical readiness for military service. However, the actual use of these weapons became increasingly ceremonial, with most samurai possessing only basic sword skills and no experience in actual combat. The codification of samurai behaviour through house codes, known as cocoon, represented another crucial element in the transformation of warrior culture. These documents, produced by virtually every daimyo domain during the early Tokugawa period, established detailed regulations governing every aspect of samurai conduct, from dress and deportment to marriage arrangements and financial management. The cocoons served both practical and ideological functions, providing domain administrators with tools for controlling their retainers while articulating philosophical principles that justified the samurai's continued privileged position. The Bukushohato, or laws for military houses, issued by the Tokugawa government in 1615 and revised periodically throughout the early Edo period, established national standards for samurai behaviour that superseded local domain regulations. These laws prohibited private warfare, regulated castle construction and repair, required official permission for marriages between samurai families from different domains, and established detailed protocols for interactions with the imperial court. The Bukushohato effectively transformed the samurai from autonomous military leaders into civil servants whose activities were subject to comprehensive government oversight. The development of bushidō philosophy during this period provided intellectual justification for the samurai's transformation, while preserving elements of warrior identity that could be adapted to peacetime conditions, unlike the practical warrior ethos of the Sengoku period, which had emphasized effectiveness in combat and loyalty to successful commanders. Tokugawa-era bushidō stressed abstract virtues such as moral cultivation, aesthetic refinement, and absolute loyalty to one's hereditary lord regardless of personal consequences. This philosophical system drew heavily from Neo-Confucian ethics, Zen Buddhist concepts of self-discipline, and romanticized interpretations of earlier warrior traditions. The emphasis on loyalty as the supreme samurai virtue served the Tokugawa system's need for political stability, while providing warriors with a sense of purpose that did not depend on military activity. The ideal samurai, as depicted in Cocoon and popular literature, demonstrated his worth through unwavering service to his lord, meticulous attention to administrative duties, and cultivation of cultural accomplishments such as poetry, calligraphy, and tea ceremony. This model effectively channeled warrior energies toward activities that supported rather than threatened the established political order. The transformation of martial arts from practical combat training into formalized systems of physical and spiritual discipline reflected the broader changes affecting samurai culture. The various schools of swordsmanship, archery, and other military skills that proliferated during the Tokugawa period emphasized character development and philosophical insight rather than battlefield effectiveness. These martial arts schools, known as ryuha, developed elaborate theoretical frameworks that connected physical training with moral cultivation and spiritual enlightenment, providing samurai with activities that maintained their warrior identity while serving no practical military purpose. The economic challenges facing the samurai class became increasingly severe as the Tokugawa period progressed, and Japan's economy became more sophisticated and commercialized. The stipend system that replaced the earlier practice of granting land to retainers created fundamental problems that domain administrators struggled to address throughout the period. Samurai stipends, typically paid in rice, remained fixed at levels established during the early 17th century, while the cost of goods and services continued to rise due to population growth, urbanization, and increased commercial activity. The conversion of rice stipends into cash payments, implemented by many domains during the mid-Tokugawa period, exposed samurai to market fluctuations that they were poorly equipped to understand or manage. Rice prices varied significantly based on harvest conditions, regional supply and demand factors, and speculative activity by merchant traders who had developed sophisticated techniques for manipulating commodity markets. Samurai, trained in administrative procedures and cultural accomplishments rather than commercial practices, frequently found themselves at the mercy of merchant creditors who understood market mechanisms far better than their supposedly superior social betters. The prohibition against samurai engaging in commercial activities, enforced through both legal restrictions and social stigma, prevented warriors from adapting to economic changes through entrepreneurial activity. While some samurai secretly invested in commercial ventures or worked as advisors to merchant enterprises, such activities violated the ideological principles that justified their elevated social status. The Confucian emphasis on the moral superiority of agricultural production over commercial manipulation meant that samurai who engaged in trade risked losing not only their legal privileges, but also their social identity as members of the warrior class. The growth of urban merchant communities during the Tokugawa period created alternative centers of wealth and influence that challenged samurai assumptions about social hierarchy and economic relationships. Cities such as Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto developed sophisticated commercial networks that generated enormous profits for successful merchants while providing employment opportunities for displaced farmers and artisans. These urban centres operated according to market principles that rewarded efficiency, innovation, and customer service rather than hereditary status or bureaucratic rank. The cultural achievements of merchant communities, particularly in areas such as literature, theatre and visual arts, created alternative sources of prestige and social recognition that competed with traditional samurai culture. The development of kabuki theatre, ukiyo-e woodblock prints, and popular fiction reflected merchant tastes and values while attracting audiences from all social classes. These cultural forms celebrated commercial success, romantic love, and individual achievement in ways that directly contradicted the Confucian ideology that justified samurai superiority. The increasing indebtedness of both individual samurai and entire domains created systemic problems that threatened the stability of the Tokugawa system. Many samurai borrowed money from wealthy merchants to maintain the lifestyle expected of their social position, using their stipends as collateral for loans that often exceeded their ability to repay. Domain governments faced similar problems on a larger scale, borrowing from merchant financiers to fund sankin kutai obligations, infrastructure projects, and disaster relief while struggling to service their debts from agricultural tax revenues that remained relatively static. The social tensions generated by these economic disparities became increasingly evident during the later Tokugawa period, as impoverished samurai observed the growing wealth and influence of merchant families who theoretically occupied the lowest position in the social hierarchy. The spectacle of debt-ridden warriors seeking loans from prosperous merchants who lived in luxury while maintaining humble public personas created cognitive dissonance that undermined confidence in the existing social order. Some samurai began questioning whether a system that rewarded commercial success while impoverishing the warrior class truly reflected natural law and moral principles. The development of rangaku or Dutch learning during the 18th century provided some samurai with access to Western scientific and technical knowledge that offered alternatives to traditional Chinese-derived scholarship. The study of European medicine, astronomy, geography and military technology attracted intellectually curious samurai who recognized the practical limitations of conventional Confucian education. However, the government's restrictions on foreign contact and the social stigma associated with excessive interest in barbarian knowledge limited the spread of these ideas and their impact on samurai culture. The periodic reforms attempted by various shogunal administrations during the 18th century reflected growing recognition that the economic problems facing the samurai class threatened the stability of the entire political system. The Kyoho reforms implemented by the 8th shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune included measures designed to reduce government expenses, increase agricultural productivity, and provide debt relief for impoverished samurai. However, these efforts achieved only limited success because they failed to address the fundamental structural problems created by the transformation of warriors into bureaucratic administrators in an increasingly commercial economy. The emergence of new forms of popular entertainment and consumer goods during the mid-Tokugawa period created additional financial pressures on samurai families who felt obligated to participate in urban culture despite their limited resources. The development of restaurants, pleasure quarters, and commercial entertainment districts in major cities offered diversions that required cash expenditures rather than the rice-based transactions that had characterized earlier periods. Samurai who wished to maintain their social standing found themselves competing with wealthy merchants in consumption patterns that their fixed stipends could not sustain. The education system that developed during the Tokugawa period reflected both the practical needs of domain administration and the ideological requirements of maintaining samurai identity. Domain schools, established throughout Japan during the 17th and 18th centuries, provided samurai children with instruction in Confucian classics, calligraphy, arithmetic, and other subjects necessary for bureaucratic careers. However, this educational curriculum, while producing competent administrators, failed to prepare samurai for the economic challenges they would face as adults, or provide them with skills that could generate independent income. The increasing sophistication of domain administrative systems during the later Tokugawa period created opportunities for capable samurai to advance through bureaucratic hierarchies, but also intensified competition for desirable positions. The development of specialized administrative roles in areas such as finance, legal affairs, and foreign relations required technical expertise that went beyond traditional samurai education. Some domains began recruiting talented individuals from lower social classes to fill these positions, creating resentment among hereditary samurai who felt their birthright privileges were being undermined by merit-based appointments. The ascension of the fifth Tokugawa shogun, Tsunayoshi, in 1680 coincided with Japan's emergence from the economic instability and natural disasters that had plagued the middle decades of the 17th century. By 1688, the beginning of the Genroku era, the nation had achieved a level of prosperity and cultural sophistication that would have been unimaginable during the chaotic Sengoku period. The population of Edo had swelled to over 1 million inhabitants, making it the largest city in the world at that time, surpassing even London and Paris in both size and complexity. This massive urban centre had evolved far beyond its origins as a military headquarters, becoming a sophisticated metropolis where samurai administrators, wealthy merchants, skilled artisans, and entertainment workers created a vibrant society that both celebrated and questioned traditional warrior values. The physical transformation of Edo during this period reflected the profound changes occurring within Japanese society. The city's layout, originally designed around the defensive requirements of Tokugawa military power, had expanded to accommodate the diverse needs of its enormous population. The areas surrounding Edo Castle, once dominated by the massive compounds of major daimyo and their retainer bands, now included elaborate commercial districts where merchants displayed goods from across Japan and beyond. The Nihonbashi district had become the commercial heart of the nation, where rice brokers, silk merchants, and money changers conducted transactions that affected prices throughout the archipelago. The development of sophisticated urban infrastructure during the Genroku period demonstrated the administrative capabilities that the Tokugawa system had developed through decades of peaceful governance. The city's water supply system, drawing from distant mountain sources through an intricate network of wooden pipes and stone channels, provided clean water to neighbourhoods throughout Edo. The waste management systems, involving coordinated collection and disposal operations that employed thousands of workers, maintained sanitary conditions that supported the dense urban population. Fire prevention and response capabilities, crucial in a city constructed primarily of wood and paper, involved elaborate networks of watchtowers, fire brigades, and emergency protocols that could mobilize entire neighborhoods in response to threats. The cultural flowering that characterized the Genroku era emerged from the intersection of samurai refinement, merchant wealth, and urban sophistication. The pleasure quarters of Yoshiwara, established as licensed districts for prostitution and entertainment, evolved into centers of artistic innovation where kabuki actors, courtesans, musicians, and writers created new forms of cultural expression that appealed to audiences across social boundaries. These districts, while officially segregated from respectable society, attracted customers from all social classes who sought entertainment that was more immediate and emotionally engaging than the formal cultural activities associated with traditional samurai culture. The emergence of ukiyo-e woodblock printing during this period revolutionized the distribution of visual art and created new forms of cultural communication that reached audiences far beyond the traditional elite. Artists such as Hishikawa Moronobu developed techniques for mass-producing images that depicted contemporary urban life with unprecedented realism and artistic sophistication. These prints, affordable to middle-class consumers, featured scenes from kabuki theatre, portraits of famous courtesans, landscapes, and everyday activities that celebrated the vitality and diversity of urban culture. The literary achievements of the Genroku period reflected the complex relationship between traditional samurai values and the realities of contemporary urban life. Ihara Saikaku's novels, focusing on the lives of merchants, artisans, and pleasure seekers, depicted a world where success depended on wit, adaptability, and understanding of human nature rather than hereditary status or martial prowess. His characters navigated complex social situations through intelligence and charm, achieving their goals through methods that would have been considered inappropriate or dishonourable according to traditional warrior ethics. The development of Bunraku puppet theatre during this period provided another venue for exploring themes that challenged conventional social assumptions. The plays of Chikamatsu Monzaemon, combining historical subjects with contemporary social commentary, presented audiences with moral dilemmas that had no clear resolutions according to traditional ethical systems. His characters, whether historical figures or contemporary types, faced conflicts between social obligations and personal desires that reflected the tensions experienced by real people living in an increasingly complex urban environment. The Akko incident of 1703 emerged from this cultural context as a real-life drama that embodied the fundamental tensions between legal obligation and traditional concepts of loyalty and honour. The origins of this conflict lay in the complex ceremonial requirements that governed interactions between daimyo and shogunal officials during formal court functions. Asano Naganori, the young lord of the Akko domain in Harima province, had been appointed to assist with preparations for receiving imperial envoys at Edo Castle, a responsibility that required mastery of intricate protocols that had evolved over decades of Tokugawa rule. The specific incident that triggered the crisis occurred during a formal ceremony in the Matsu no Oroka, the pine corridor of Edo Castle, where Asano drew his sword and attacked Kira Yoshinaka, the shogunal master of ceremonies responsible for instructing daimyo in proper protocols. The attack, which resulted in minor wounds to Kira's face and head, violated the fundamental prohibition against drawing weapons within the shogun's residence and constituted an unprecedented breach of castle security. Contemporary accounts suggest that the assault resulted from accumulated frustration over Kira's demanding and allegedly corrupt behaviour during the preparation period, though the exact nature of their dispute remains unclear. The shogunal response to this incident reflected the legal principles and political priorities that governed Tokugawa administration. Asano was ordered to commit seppuku the same day. His domain was confiscated, and his retainers were dismissed from service, becoming ronin without warning or preparation. This swift punishment demonstrated the government's determination to maintain order within the castle and preserve the ceremonial dignity that legitimised shogunal authority. However, the decision to punish only Asano, while taking no action against Kira, despite evidence that he had contributed to the conflict, created a sense of injustice that would have profound consequences. The transformation of Asano's former retainers into ronin placed them in an impossible situation that highlighted the contradictions within the Tokugawa social system. As masterless samurai, they had lost not only their economic support but also their social identity and legal status within the established hierarchy. The traditional warrior code demanded that they avenge their lord's death and restore his honour, but any attempt to do so would violate the law and result in their own destruction. This dilemma reflected broader tensions within samurai society between traditional values that emphasized personal honor and loyalty, and legal requirements that prioritized social stability and government authority. Oishi Yoshio, the former chief retainer of the Akko domain, emerged as the leader of those retainers who chose to pursue vengeance despite the legal consequences. His careful planning over nearly 2 years demonstrated both the strategic thinking that characterized effective samurai leadership and the practical challenges facing any attempt to circumvent government security measures. Oishi recognized that success required not only careful coordination among the conspirators, but also deception sophisticated enough to avoid detection by the extensive intelligence networks that the Tokugawa government maintained throughout Edo. The elaborate deception that Oishi employed to conceal his intentions involved adopting the lifestyle of a dissolute ronin who had abandoned samurai values in favor of pleasure-seeking and self-indulgence. He frequented the Yoshiwara district, engaged in public drinking and gambling, and behaved in ways that violated every principle of samurai conduct. This performance, maintained for months while he secretly coordinated with other conspirators, required him to endure public humiliation and personal degradation that tested his commitment to the larger purpose. The psychological cost of this deception, which involved betraying his own moral principles in service of a higher loyalty, illustrated the complex ethical calculations that the incident forced upon its participants. The assault on Kira's residence on the morning of December 14, 1702, demonstrated both the military capabilities that former samurai retained despite decades of peace and the careful planning required for such an operation in the heavily regulated environment of Edo. The 47 conspirators, divided into two groups attacking from different directions, overcame the guards and servants defending the compound through coordinated tactics that reflected their professional military training. The operation, completed in less than 2 hours, resulted in Kira's death and the recovery of his head as proof that their lord's honour had been restored. The aftermath of the vendetta created a crisis for the Tokugawa government that exposed fundamental contradictions within the official ideology. The Ronin had clearly violated the law and deserved punishment according to legal principles, but their actions embodied the loyalty and self-sacrifice that the government promoted as essential samurai virtues. Public opinion, expressed through popular literature, theatre and informal discussion, overwhelmingly supported the Ronin and viewed their actions as heroic examples of proper warrior behaviour. This popular response placed government officials in the difficult position of punishing behaviour that most people considered admirable and morally correct. The extensive deliberations that preceded the government's final decision reflected the complexity of the issues involved and the recognition that the resolution would establish important precedents for future cases. The discussions, involving senior officials, legal scholars, and Confucian advisors, explored questions about the relationship between law and morality, the obligations of retainers to deceased lords, and the proper balance between social stability and traditional values. The final decision to allow the Ronin to commit seppuku, rather than executing them as common criminals, represented a compromise that acknowledged their moral motivation while maintaining the principle that illegal actions must have consequences. The cultural impact of the Akko incident extended far beyond its immediate political implications to influence Japanese popular culture for centuries. The story, transformed through kabuki plays, bunraku performances, novels, and eventually films, became a foundational narrative that explored themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and moral conflict that resonated with audiences across different historical periods. The 47 Ronin became cultural heroes, whose actions provided a model for behaviour that transcended the specific circumstances of their time and offered guidance for individuals facing conflicts between competing moral obligations. The flourishing of samurai intellectual culture during the Genroku period reflected both the practical needs of domain administration and the philosophical questions raised by the transformation of warrior society. Neo-Confucian academies, established in domains throughout Japan, provided samurai with access to Chinese philosophical texts and scholarly traditions that had previously been available only to court nobles and Buddhist monks. These institutions, while serving the practical purpose of training administrative personnel, also created communities of scholars who engaged in sophisticated discussions about governance, ethics, and social organization. The Shoheiko Academy, established by the Tokugawa government in Edo, became the most influential centre for Neo-Confucian learning and set standards for scholarship that affected educational institutions throughout Japan. The academy's curriculum, based on the writings of Ju Shi and other Song dynasty philosophers, emphasized the cultivation of moral character through study of classical texts and the application of philosophical principles to practical governance problems. Students learned not only the content of Confucian teachings, but also methods of textual analysis and philosophical argumentation that equipped them for careers in domain administration or scholarly research. The development of various schools of Neo-Confucian thought during this period reflected both intellectual sophistication and practical concerns about governance and social organization. The Kimon school, founded by Yamazaki Ansai, emphasized strict adherence to orthodox interpretations of Confucian texts and promoted conservative approaches to social and political questions. In contrast, the Kogaku school, associated with scholars such as Yamaga Soko and Ito Jinsai, advocated return to original Confucian sources and criticized later interpretations that they considered corrupted by Buddhist and other non-Chinese influences. The emergence of Rangaku, or Dutch learning, during this period provided samurai intellectuals with access to European scientific and technical knowledge that challenged traditional assumptions about natural phenomena and technological capabilities. The study of Dutch medical texts, introduced through the limited trade contacts maintained at Nagasaki, revealed anatomical and surgical knowledge that contradicted Chinese medical theories that had been accepted as authoritative for centuries. Similarly, European works on astronomy, mathematics, and geography provided information about the natural world that forced scholars to reconsider fundamental assumptions about Japan's place in the global context. The practical applications of Rangaku knowledge became evident in various domains, where progressive administrators encouraged the study of European techniques for improving agricultural productivity, manufacturing processes, and military capabilities. Some domains established translation projects that made Dutch technical manuals available in Japanese, while others sent selected retainers to Nagasaki to study with the Dutch traders and their interpreters. These efforts, while limited by government restrictions on foreign contact, created networks of scholars who shared information about European innovations and their potential applications to Japanese conditions. The development of various martial arts schools during the Genroku period reflected the transformation of samurai military training from practical combat preparation into systems of physical and spiritual discipline. The proliferation of ryuha, or schools of martial arts, provided samurai with activities that maintained their warrior identity while serving philosophical and educational purposes rather than military ones. Each school developed distinctive techniques, philosophical principles, and training methods that were transmitted through formal master-student relationships and protected as proprietary knowledge. The Niten-ryu school, founded by the legendary swordsman Minamoto Musashi, exemplified the integration of martial technique with philosophical insight that characterized Tokugawa-era martial arts. Musashi's teachings, preserved in texts such as the Book of Five Rings, presented swordsmanship as a path to understanding fundamental principles that applied to all aspects of life. His emphasis on mental clarity, strategic thinking, and adaptability to changing circumstances provided samurai with intellectual frameworks that could be applied to administrative responsibilities and personal development. The economic diversification that characterized samurai society during this period reflected both financial necessity and changing attitudes toward commercial activity. Despite official prohibitions against samurai engaging in trade, many warriors found ways to participate in commercial ventures through indirect methods that preserved the appearance of maintaining their social status. Some samurai invested in merchant enterprises through intermediaries, while others used their administrative positions to facilitate trade relationships that generated unofficial income. These activities, while technically illegal, became increasingly common as domain finances deteriorated and individual samurai struggled to maintain their expected lifestyle on fixed stipends. The development of new forms of cultural expression during the Genroku period reflected the creative energy generated by the interaction between different social classes in urban environments. The emergence of haiku poetry as a distinct literary form, perfected by masters such as Matsuo Basho, demonstrated how traditional aesthetic principles could be adapted to express contemporary sensibilities. Basho's travel narratives, combining poetic observation with philosophical reflection, created new models for literary expression that influenced writers across social boundaries and established precedents for exploring the relationship between artistic creation and personal experience. The sophistication of urban entertainment during this period created new opportunities for samurai to participate in cultural activities that would have been impossible in earlier eras. The development of professional sumo wrestling, with organised tournaments and celebrity wrestlers who attracted devoted followings, provided spectacles that appealed to audiences across social classes. Similarly, the growth of commercial theatre districts created venues where samurai could enjoy performances alongside merchants and artisans, participating in shared cultural experiences that transcended traditional social boundaries while maintaining their distinct identity through seating arrangements and behavioural protocols that preserved hierarchical distinctions. The cultural flowering of the Genroku era had masked underlying structural problems that became increasingly apparent as Japan entered the second half of the 18th century. The sophisticated urban society that had emerged in Edo, Osaka, and other major cities depended on agricultural productivity that remained vulnerable to natural disasters. While the elaborate governmental systems developed during the early Tokugawa period struggled to address the financial crises that plagued both individual domains and the shogunal administration itself. The mounting pressures facing the warrior class during this period would test the adaptability of institutions that had been designed for an era of stability and prosperity, rather than the environmental catastrophes and economic disruptions that characterized the later Edo period. The Tenmei famine of 1782 to 1788 exposed the fragility of Japan's agricultural foundation and the inadequacy of existing relief systems. The crisis began with the eruption of Mount Asama in 1783, which ejected massive quantities of volcanic ash into the atmosphere and disrupted weather patterns across northern Japan. The resulting crop failures, compounded by unusually cold summers and early frosts, created food shortages that affected millions of people and strained the resources of domains throughout the archipelago. Contemporary records indicate that some regions experienced population declines of 20 to 30% as starvation, disease, and migration reduced communities that had been stable for generations. The samurai administrative response to this disaster revealed both the capabilities and limitations of Tokugawa governance systems. Domain officials, trained in Confucian principles that emphasized the ruler's responsibility for popular welfare, implemented emergency measures that included opening granaries, distributing seed rice, and organizing public works projects to provide employment for displaced farmers. However, these efforts required financial resources that many domains lacked, forcing administrators to choose between maintaining their retainer stipends and providing adequate disaster relief. The moral and practical dilemmas created by these choices undermined confidence in the existing social order and generated resentment that would persist for decades. The Tenpo famine of 1833 to 1837, even more severe than its predecessor, demonstrated that the problems revealed during the Tenmei crisis had not been resolved through the reform efforts of the intervening decades. This disaster, triggered by a combination of volcanic activity, unusual weather patterns, and crop diseases, created widespread starvation that affected both rural and urban populations. The city of Edo, despite its sophisticated supply networks and government stockpiles, experienced food riots as desperate residents attacked rice warehouses and merchant establishments. These urban disturbances, unprecedented in their scale and violence, shocked samurai administrators who had assumed that their capital city was immune to the disorders that might affect remote rural areas. The Oshio Heihachiro rebellion of 1837 emerged directly from the frustrations generated by the Tenpo famine and the perceived inadequacy of official relief efforts. Oshio, a former Osaka magistrate and accomplished Confucian scholar, had observed firsthand the suffering of urban poor, while wealthy rice merchants continued to export grain to other regions where prices were higher. His decision to lead an armed uprising against the Osaka city government represented a fundamental challenge to the principle that samurai should work within existing institutions rather than resort to violence against legitimate authority. The rebellion itself, though suppressed within a single day, demonstrated the potential for educated samurai to mobilize popular discontent against the established order. Oshio's proclamations, written in accessible language and distributed throughout Osaka's commercial districts, articulated grievances that resonated with audiences across social boundaries. His criticism of corrupt officials, greedy merchants, and inadequate relief policies provided a coherent explanation for the suffering that people experienced daily, while his call for direct action offered an alternative to passive acceptance of intolerable conditions. The ideological significance of Oshio's rebellion extended far beyond its immediate military impact. As a respected scholar and former government official, Oshio possessed credentials that made his criticisms of the existing system particularly damaging to official legitimacy. His writings, combining Confucian moral principles with the practical observations about contemporary conditions, provided intellectual frameworks that other critics could adopt and develop. The fact that such a prominent member of the samurai class had concluded that armed resistance was necessary suggested that the problems facing Japanese society were more fundamental than routine administrative difficulties. The peasant uprisings that proliferated during this period reflected both immediate economic hardships and deeper changes in rural social organization. The ikki, or peasant leagues, that organized these disturbances had evolved from traditional village associations into sophisticated networks capable of coordinating resistance across multiple domains. These organizations, led by wealthy farmers and village headmen who possessed literacy and administrative experience, could mobilize thousands of participants and sustain organized activities for weeks or months, despite government suppression efforts. The scale and sophistication of these peasant movements challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and political authority. The Bushu Ikki of 1866, which involved over 200,000 participants across multiple provinces, demonstrated organizational capabilities that rivaled those of domain governments. The uprising's leaders, drawn from the rural elite class that had emerged during the commercialization of agriculture, possessed resources and connections that enabled them to coordinate activities across vast geographical areas while maintaining communication networks that government authorities struggled to penetrate or disrupt. The samurai response to these popular disturbances revealed the extent to which the warrior class had become dependent on the stability of the existing social order. Many samurai, particularly those serving in rural administrative positions, found themselves caught between their obligations to maintain government authority and their recognition that popular grievances were often justified. The traditional warrior emphasis on moral leadership became problematic when government policies clearly violated Confucian principles of benevolent governance, forcing individual samurai to choose between loyalty to their superiors and adherence to ethical principles. The Kyoho reforms, implemented by the 8th shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune between 1716 and 1745, represented the first systematic attempt to address the structural problems that were undermining Tokugawa governance. Yoshimune, recognizing that financial difficulties were at the root of many administrative problems, initiated policies designed to increase government revenues while reducing expenditures. His approach combined traditional methods such as promoting agricultural development and enforcing sumptuary laws with innovative measures that included encouraging the cultivation of new crops and establishing government monopolies over certain commercial activities. The practical implementation of these reforms required samurai administrators to develop new forms of expertise in areas such as agricultural technology, commercial regulation, and financial management. Domain officials found themselves responsible for promoting the cultivation of sweet potatoes, tobacco, and other crops that had not been part of traditional Japanese agriculture, while simultaneously learning to manage complex relationships with merchant groups who possessed superior knowledge of market conditions and commercial practices. This expansion of administrative responsibilities created opportunities for capable samurai to demonstrate their value while highlighting the inadequacy of traditional Confucian education for addressing contemporary challenges. The Kansei reforms of 1787 to 1793, implemented under the leadership of senior councillor Matsudera Sadanobu, reflected a more conservative approach that emphasized moral regeneration and return to traditional values as solutions to contemporary problems. Sadanobu, grandson of the 8th shogun and a prominent advocate of orthodox Neo-Confucian principles, argued that Japan's difficulties resulted from moral decay and departure from the ethical standards that had characterized earlier periods of prosperity and stability. His reform program included measures to strengthen samurai education, eliminate corruption in government administration, and restore the social boundaries that had become blurred through commercial development and urban sophistication. The educational initiatives implemented during the Kansei period established new standards for samurai training that emphasized classical scholarship and moral cultivation over practical skills. The expansion of domain schools and the standardization of curricula based on orthodox Confucian texts were intended to produce administrators who possessed both the technical competence and ethical foundation necessary for effective governance. However, these educational reforms also reflected conservative assumptions about the sources of contemporary problems that may have been inadequate for addressing the complex challenges facing Japanese society. The Tenpo reforms of 1841 to 1843, led by senior councillor Mizuno Tadakuni, represented the most ambitious attempt to restructure Japanese society through government intervention. Mizuno's program included measures to relocate urban populations back to rural areas, eliminate unauthorized commercial activities, and restore the social order that had allegedly existed during the early Tokugawa period. These policies reflected both genuine concern about social problems and a fundamental misunderstanding of the economic and demographic changes that had transformed Japanese society during the previous 2 centuries. The failure of the Tenpo reforms demonstrated the limitations of administrative solutions to problems that had deeper structural causes. Mizuno's attempts to relocate urban residents to rural areas ignored the economic realities that had drawn people to cities in the first place, while his efforts to suppress commercial activities disrupted supply networks that had become essential for maintaining urban populations. The resistance that these policies encountered from both merchants and common people revealed the extent to which Japanese society had moved beyond the simple agricultural foundation that conservative reformers sought to restore. The intellectual ferment that accompanied these reform efforts produced new forms of scholarship that challenged traditional assumptions about governance and social organization. The development of kokugaku, or national learning, provided alternatives to Chinese-derived intellectual frameworks that had dominated Japanese scholarship for centuries. Scholars such as Moturi Norinaga and Hirata Atsutane argued that Japan possessed indigenous traditions of knowledge and governance that were superior to foreign imports and more suitable for addressing contemporary challenges. The Kokugaku emphasis on Japanese uniqueness and cultural superiority resonated with samurai who had become frustrated with the limitations of Confucian approaches to contemporary problems. The movement's focus on ancient Japanese texts such as the Kojiki and Manyoshu provided scholars with sources of authority that were independent of Chinese precedents, while its celebration of imperial tradition offered alternatives to the shogunal system that had proven inadequate for addressing current challenges. These intellectual developments created ideological foundations for political movements that would emerge during the final decades of the Tokugawa period. The Sono-Joi movement, combining reverence for the emperor with opposition to foreign influence, represented a synthesis of Kokugaku scholarship with practical concerns about Japan's international position. The slogan, "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians," provided a simple but powerful formula that could unite diverse groups who shared dissatisfaction with existing conditions while offering a clear program for political action. The movement's emphasis on imperial restoration appealed to samurai who sought alternatives to the Tokugawa system, while its anti-foreign stance resonated with those who viewed Western influence as a threat to Japanese independence and cultural integrity. The practical challenges facing domain administrations during this period forced many samurai to develop new forms of expertise in areas such as military technology, international relations, and economic development. The increasing awareness of Western military capabilities, transmitted through Dutch learning and direct observation of foreign ships, created pressure for military reforms that went beyond traditional martial arts training. Some domains established Western-style military units equipped with modern firearms and trained in European tactical methods, while others invested in coastal fortifications designed to resist potential foreign invasion. The financial pressures that accompanied these military preparations exacerbated the economic problems that had been building throughout the late Tokugawa period. The cost of purchasing modern weapons, constructing fortifications, and maintaining military units trained in Western methods strained domain budgets that were already stretched by the expenses of sankin katai and disaster relief. Many domains found themselves forced to choose between maintaining their traditional obligations and preparing for potential military challenges, creating tensions that undermined the stability of the entire system. The growing recognition that Japan's isolation policy might be unsustainable in the face of Western expansion created divisions within samurai society about the proper response to foreign pressure. Some warriors, influenced by Rangaku scholarship and direct observation of Western capabilities, argued that Japan needed to abandon its traditional isolation and adopt Western technology and institutions to maintain its independence. Others, drawing on Kokugaku teachings and traditional xenophobia, insisted that foreign influence represented a fundamental threat to Japanese culture and political independence that must be resisted at any cost. These debates about foreign policy became increasingly urgent as reports of Western expansion in Asia reached Japan through Dutch and Chinese sources. The Opium War of 1839 to 1842, in which British forces had defeated Chinese armies and forced the Qing government to accept humiliating treaty terms, demonstrated the military superiority that Western powers could deploy against Asian opponents. The implications of this conflict for Japan's own security became a subject of intense discussion among samurai intellectuals and government officials who recognized that their nation's isolation might not provide adequate protection against determined foreign pressure. The internal contradictions within samurai society became increasingly apparent as these various pressures mounted during the 1840s and early 1850s. The warrior class found itself simultaneously responsible for maintaining traditional social order and adapting to unprecedented challenges that required new forms of knowledge and institutional innovation. The tension between preserving samurai privilege and addressing practical problems created conflicts that individual warriors struggled to resolve within existing ideological frameworks. The emergence of new forms of political organization during this period reflected both the inadequacy of traditional institutions and the creative potential of samurai who were willing to experiment with alternative approaches. Study groups, discussion societies, and informal networks provided venues for exploring ideas and developing strategies that went beyond the limitations of official channels. These organizations, while often small and secretive, created connections between like-minded individuals across domain boundaries and established foundations for the political movements that would emerge during the final crisis of Tokugawa rule. The mounting evidence of systemic problems within Japanese society created a sense of impending crisis that affected all levels of the social hierarchy. Natural disasters, economic difficulties, popular uprisings, and foreign pressure combined to create challenges that existing institutions seemed incapable of addressing effectively. The reform movements of this period, despite their innovative elements and genuine efforts to address real problems, had failed to provide sustainable solutions to the fundamental contradictions within the Tokugawa system. As the 1850s began, Japan faced an uncertain future in which traditional approaches to governance and social organization would be tested by forces that would ultimately transform the nation beyond recognition. The pressures that had been building throughout the late Edo period reached a critical juncture on July 8, 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry's 4 black ships appeared in Edo Bay, their steam engines billowing dark smoke that could be seen from the shogun's castle. The sight of these iron-hulled vessels, armed with modern cannons and capable of moving against wind and tide, shattered the illusion of security that Japan's isolation policy had provided for over 2 centuries. Perry's squadron, consisting of the steam frigates Susquehanna and Mississippi, along with the sailing ships Plymouth and Saratoga, represented technological capabilities that Japanese coastal defences were utterly unprepared to confront. The immediate response of the Tokugawa government revealed the paralysis that had gripped the shogunal administration in the face of unprecedented challenges. Senior officials, trained in the elaborate protocols of domestic governance but lacking experience with international diplomacy, struggled to formulate coherent responses to Perry's demands for trade relations and coaling stations. The shogun's advisors spent weeks debating whether to meet the American Commodore's representatives, while coastal batteries remained unmanned and the few available warships stayed safely anchored in inner harbours where they could not effectively challenge the foreign intruders. Perry's strategic approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Japanese political psychology and the internal weaknesses that plague the Tokugawa system. Rather than immediately demanding negotiations, he delivered President Fillmore's letter requesting trade relations and announced his intention to return the following year for a response, giving Japanese officials time to consider their options while making clear that refusal would have serious consequences. This calculated display of restraint, combined with demonstrations of American naval firepower that included cannon salutes audible throughout Edo, created maximum psychological impact while avoiding immediate military confrontation. The year-long interval between Perry's first and second visits exposed the fundamental divisions within samurai society about how Japan should respond to foreign pressure. The shogunal government, recognizing its inability to resist American demands through military force, solicited opinions from daimyo throughout the country in an unprecedented departure from traditional decision-making procedures. This consultation process, while intended to build consensus for accommodation with foreign powers, instead revealed the depth of disagreement among the warrior class about Japan's proper course of action. The responses submitted by various domains reflected the intellectual and ideological ferment that had been developing within samurai society throughout the late Edo period. Progressive daimyo such as Shimazu Nariakira of Satsuma and Nabeshima Naomasa of Saga argued that Japan needed to abandon its isolation policy and adopt Western technology to maintain its independence. Conservative lords, particularly those associated with the imperial court in Kyoto, insisted that opening the country to foreign influence would corrupt Japanese culture and undermine the political order that had maintained stability for over 2 centuries. The Treaty of Kanagawa, signed on March 31, 1854, represented a compromise that satisfied neither foreign demands nor domestic opposition, but reflected the limited options available to the Tokugawa government. The agreement opened 2 ports to American ships for provisioning and established consular relations, while avoiding the comprehensive commercial arrangements that would follow in subsequent negotiations. However, the treaty's significance extended far beyond its specific provisions to establish the precedent that foreign powers could compel Japan to modify its traditional policies through the threat of military force. The domestic political crisis triggered by this forced opening intensified as additional Western powers demanded similar treaty arrangements. The Harris Treaty of 1858, negotiating more extensive commercial relations with the United States, required Japanese officials to accept extraterritorial rights for foreign residents and limitations on customs duties that compromise national sovereignty. These concessions, negotiated without imperial approval, provided opponents of the Tokugawa government with powerful arguments about the shogunate's betrayal of Japanese interests and inability to defend national independence. The emergence of the Sono-Joi movement as a coherent political force reflected the convergence of anti-foreign sentiment with broader dissatisfaction about Tokugawa governance. The slogan "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians" provided a rallying cry that could unite diverse groups of samurai who shared opposition to the existing order while offering a clear alternative program based on imperial restoration and resistance to Western influence. The movement's intellectual foundations, drawing on Kokugaku scholarship and traditional concepts of imperial legitimacy, resonated with warriors who had become disillusioned with the practical failures of shogunal administration. The Ansei Purge of 1858 to 1860, implemented by senior councillor Ii Naosuke in response to growing opposition, demonstrated both the authoritarian potential of the Tokugawa system and its ultimate inability to suppress dissent through repressive measures. T's campaign against Sono-Joi activists resulted in the execution or imprisonment of over 100 samurai from various domains, including prominent intellectuals and political leaders who had advocated imperial restoration. However, these harsh measures, rather than deterring opposition, instead created martyrs whose deaths inspired additional resistance and undermined the moral authority that the shogunal government needed to maintain legitimacy. The assassination of Ii Naosuke outside the Sakurada Gate of Edo Castle on March 24, 1860, marked a turning point in the political crisis that would ultimately destroy Tokugawa rule. The attack, carried out by 18 ronin from Mito and Satsuma domains, demonstrated the willingness of Sono-Joi activists to resort to terrorism against government officials who collaborated with foreign powers. The successful penetration of the shogun's security perimeter and the public nature of the assassination created a psychological shock that reverberated throughout the warrior class and exposed the vulnerability of even the highest Tokugawa officials. The political vacuum created by Ii's death and the broader crisis of confidence in shogunal leadership provided opportunities for ambitious domains to assert greater independence while positioning themselves as defenders of imperial interests. Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and other Western domains began implementing military reforms and developing autonomous foreign policies that challenged Tokugawa authority. These domains, geographically distant from Edo and possessing strong traditions of independence, became centres of resistance that would ultimately coordinate the overthrow of the shogunal system. The Satsuma domain's response to the changing political situation exemplified the pragmatic adaptation that characterized the most successful opponents of Tokugawa rule. Under the leadership of Shimazu Hisamitsu and his advisors Saigo Takamori and Okubo Toshimichi, Satsuma implemented comprehensive military modernization programs while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to traditional institutions. The domain established Western-style military units, purchased modern weapons through foreign trade, and developed industrial capabilities that reduced dependence on Edo-based suppliers. The Namamugi incident of September 14, 1862, demonstrated Satsuma's willingness to confront foreign powers directly while exposing the shogunate's inability to control its nominal vassals. When a British merchant named Charles Richardson failed to show proper respect to Shimazu Hisamitsu's procession, Satsuma retainers killed him and wounded his companions in accordance with traditional protocols that foreigners were expected to observe. The incident created an international crisis that the Tokugawa government was powerless to resolve, as Satsuma refused to surrender the perpetrators or pay the demanded indemnity. The subsequent bombardment of Kagoshima by the British fleet in August 1863 provided Satsuma leaders with direct experience of Western military capabilities, while demonstrating the futility of traditional coastal defences against modern naval power. The British squadron, consisting of 7 warships armed with the latest artillery, systematically destroyed Satsuma's coastal batteries and much of Kagoshima city, despite determined resistance from domain forces. However, the inconclusive nature of the engagement and the British withdrawal without achieving their political objectives convinced Satsuma leaders that Western powers could be resisted through proper preparation and modern military methods. Choshu Domain's more radical approach to the anti-foreign campaign reflected both ideological commitment and strategic calculation about the changing balance of power within Japan. Under the influence of activists such as Kido Takayoshi and Takasugi Shinsaku, Choshu positioned itself as the most uncompromising opponent of foreign influence, while implementing military reforms that incorporated Western technology and tactics. The domain's establishment of mixed units combining samurai officers with ashigaru and peasant soldiers challenged traditional military hierarchies while creating more effective fighting forces. The bombardment of foreign ships in the Straits of Shimonoseki beginning in May 1863 represented Choshu's attempt to implement the Joi policy through direct military action. Domain forces, equipped with modern artillery purchased through Dutch traders, attacked American, French and Dutch vessels transiting the strategic waterway that connected the inland sea with the open ocean. These attacks, while initially successful in disrupting foreign shipping, ultimately provoked retaliation that would expose the limitations of uncoordinated resistance to Western military power. The combined Western assault on Choshu positions in September 1864 demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of coordinated modern military forces against traditional defensive arrangements. The multinational fleet, consisting of British, French, American and Dutch warships, systematically destroyed Choshu's coastal fortifications, while landing forces occupied key positions along the shoreline. The engagement revealed both the futility of isolated resistance against Western powers and the potential effectiveness of modern military organisation when properly implemented. The Choshu Civil War of 1864 to 1865 represented a crucial test of competing approaches to military modernization and political reform within the anti-Tokugawa coalition. Conservative elements within the domain, led by traditional samurai families, opposed the radical policies that had provoked foreign retaliation and sought accommodation with the Tokugawa government. Progressive factions, organised around Takasugi Shinsaku's Kiheitai militia units, argued that successful resistance required comprehensive social and military transformation that abandoned traditional class distinctions in favour of merit-based advancement. The victory of progressive forces in this internal struggle established precedents for military and social reform that would influence the entire restoration movement. The Kiheitai units, composed of samurai, ashigaru and commoners serving together under unified command, demonstrated superior effectiveness compared to traditional domain forces organised according to hereditary status. These mixed units, equipped with modern weapons and trained in Western tactics, provided models for military organisation that other domains would adopt as they prepared for the final confrontation with Tokugawa forces. The Sacho Alliance, formalised in March 1866 through the mediation of Sakamoto Ryoma, represented the crucial political breakthrough that made the restoration possible. The agreement between Satsuma and Choshu, despite their historical rivalry and different approaches to reform, created a military coalition capable of challenging Tokugawa power while providing political coordination for the broader anti-shogunal movement. The alliance's terms, negotiating mutual military support and coordinated political action, established frameworks for cooperation that would survive the restoration and influence Meiji government organisation. The second Choshu expedition of 1866 exposed the military weakness of the Tokugawa government and demonstrated the effectiveness of the modernised domain forces that had emerged from the reform movements. The shogunal army, numbering over 100,000 troops drawn from loyal domains throughout Japan, possessed overwhelming numerical superiority but lacked the coordination and modern equipment necessary for effective operations against determined opponents. Choshu forces, though greatly outnumbered, employed superior tactics and weapons to achieve decisive victories that forced shogunal withdrawal and established the military reputation of the anti-Tokugawa coalition. The death of Shogun Tokugawa Iemochi during the campaign and the succession of Tokugawa Yoshinobu created opportunities for political compromise that might have preserved some form of Tokugawa authority within a reformed system. Yoshinobu, recognizing the impossibility of maintaining the traditional shogunal system in the face of domestic opposition and foreign pressure, initiated negotiations aimed at establishing a new governmental structure that would incorporate both imperial restoration and practical administrative requirements. However, these diplomatic efforts were overtaken by military developments and political momentum that had moved beyond the possibility of compromise solutions. The Meiji Restoration, proclaimed on January 3, 1868, represented both a revolutionary transformation and a conservative restoration that embodied the contradictions within the anti-Tokugawa movement. The Charter Oath issued by the young Emperor Meiji promised deliberative assemblies, international engagement, and social mobility while maintaining imperial authority and traditional cultural values. These commitments reflected the diverse constituencies that had supported the restoration, while acknowledging the practical requirements for governing a modernizing nation. The establishment of the new Meiji government required the systematic dismantling of institutions that had governed Japan for over 2.5 centuries. The abolition of the Han system in 1871, replacing autonomous domains with centrally administered prefectures, eliminated the political foundation of samurai power while creating unified national administration. This transformation, accomplished with minimal resistance from daimyo, who were compensated with government bonds and honorary positions, demonstrated the extent to which traditional authorities had recognized the necessity for fundamental change. The conversion of samurai stipends into government bonds represented the first step in eliminating the economic foundation of the warrior class. The commutation process, implemented between 1873 and 1876, replaced hereditary rice payments with interest-bearing securities that provided immediate capital while reducing long-term government obligations. Many samurai, lacking experience with financial instruments and commercial investment, quickly sold their bonds at substantial discounts to merchants and speculators who understood their true value, accelerating the transfer of wealth from the former warrior class to commercial interests. The prohibition of sword-wearing, implemented in 1876, eliminated the most visible symbol of samurai status and marked the formal end of their privileged position within Japanese society. The Heitere, or Sword Abolition Edict, prohibited all except military and police personnel from carrying the traditional weapons that had distinguished the warrior class for centuries. This measure, while seemingly symbolic, had profound psychological impact on samurai who had defined their identity through their relationship to these weapons and the martial traditions they represented. The establishment of universal military conscription in 1873 completed the transformation of Japan's military system, from a hereditary warrior class to a modern national army based on European models. The new system, requiring 3 years of active service from all male subjects regardless of social background, created military forces that were both larger and more professionally trained than traditional samurai armies. The integration of Western military technology, tactics, and organizational methods produced armed forces capable of defending Japan against foreign threats while maintaining domestic order. The resistance to these transformations culminated in the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, the final military challenge to the Meiji government's modernization program. Saigo Takamori, the former Satsuma leader who had played a crucial role in the restoration, emerged as the symbolic leader of samurai opposition to the new order. His decision to lead approximately 40,000 traditional warriors against the imperial government represented both personal disillusionment with the direction of reform and a broader samurai resistance to their loss of status and purpose. The siege of Kumamoto Castle, beginning in February 1877, demonstrated both the continued martial capabilities of traditional samurai forces and the superior resources available to the Meiji government. Saigo's army, composed primarily of former Satsuma samurai equipped with traditional weapons and organized according to classical military principles, initially achieved significant tactical successes against government forces. However, the defenders of Kumamoto, supported by modern artillery and supplied through secure communication lines, maintained their positions while government reinforcements assembled for the decisive campaign. The final phase of the rebellion, culminating in the Battle of Shiroyama on September 24, 1877, symbolically marked the end of the samurai era in Japanese history. Saigo's remaining forces, reduced to fewer than 500 men and surrounded by over 30,000 government troops equipped with modern weapons, made a final charge that embodied the traditional warrior values of honor and loyalty, while acknowledging the futility of resistance to the new order. Saigo's death in this engagement, whether by enemy fire or ritual suicide, provided a heroic conclusion to the samurai's role as Japan's military elite, while clearing the way for the complete modernization of Japanese society. The suppression of the Satsuma Rebellion demonstrated the effectiveness of the Meiji government's military reforms while establishing the authority of the new regime throughout Japan. The Imperial Army's victory over the most formidable traditional military force in the country proved that modern military organization and technology had made samurai warfare obsolete. The rebellion's failure also eliminated the last significant domestic challenge to the government's modernization program, enabling officials to focus their attention on international relations and economic development rather than internal security concerns. The crushing defeat of the Satsuma Rebellion marked not the end of samurai influence in Japanese society, but rather the beginning of their most profound transformation. The former warrior class, stripped of their hereditary privileges and traditional military function, faced the challenge of finding new roles within the rapidly modernizing Meiji state. Rather than disappearing into historical obscurity, many ex-samurai demonstrated remarkable adaptability, leveraging their educational background, administrative experience, and leadership skills to become architects of Japan's emergence as a modern industrial power. The integration of former samurai into Meiji society occurred through multiple channels that reflected both government policy and individual initiative. The new imperial army, despite its commitment to universal conscription, required experienced officers who could provide leadership and tactical knowledge during the transition to modern military methods. Many former samurai found natural careers as military officers, where their traditional emphasis on discipline, loyalty, and martial training proved valuable in creating professional armed forces. The army's rapid expansion during the 1880s and 1890s created numerous opportunities for advancement, particularly for ex-samurai who combined traditional leadership qualities with willingness to master Western military techniques. Government service provided another major avenue for former samurai seeking to rebuild their careers within the new system. The Meiji administration, faced with the enormous task of creating modern governmental institutions from scratch, needed educated personnel who possessed both literacy skills and understanding of administrative procedures. Ex-samurai who had comprised the bureaucratic class under the Tokugawa system possessed qualifications that made them natural candidates for positions in the expanding civil service. Their experience with record-keeping, legal procedures and personnel management proved invaluable as the government established new ministries, courts, and administrative offices throughout the country. The educational sector offered particularly attractive opportunities for former samurai who possessed scholarly inclinations and teaching abilities. The Meiji government's commitment to universal education created demand for teachers, school administrators, and curriculum developers who could implement Western educational methods while maintaining Japanese cultural values. Many ex-samurai became principals and teachers in the new school system, where their traditional emphasis on moral cultivation and character development aligned with the government's goals for citizen education. Their role in shaping the educational experiences of the first generation of modern Japanese citizens gave former samurai indirect but significant influence over the country's cultural development. Business and industry, initially viewed with suspicion by many ex-samurai due to traditional prejudices against commercial activity, gradually attracted growing numbers of former warriors who recognized the economic opportunities created by Japan's industrial development. The government's active promotion of business enterprise through subsidies, protective policies and technical assistance created favourable conditions for entrepreneurial ventures. Some ex-samurai established manufacturing companies that produced goods for domestic consumption, while others became involved in trading enterprises that connected Japanese producers with international markets. The transformation of bushidō from a practical warrior code into a nationalistic ideology represented one of the most significant developments in the evolution of samurai culture during the Meiji period. Government officials and intellectual leaders, seeking to create national unity and popular support for modernization efforts, drew selectively from samurai traditions to construct an idealized version of warrior ethics that could inspire loyalty to the emperor and commitment to national goals. This reconstructed bushidō emphasized absolute loyalty, self-sacrifice, and dedication to duty, while de-emphasizing the individualistic and pragmatic aspects of historical warrior culture. The process of ideological transformation involved systematic reinterpretation of historical sources and selective emphasis on particular aspects of samurai tradition. Government-sponsored historians and educators promoted narratives that portrayed the samurai as selfless servants of imperial authority, who had always placed national interests above personal concerns. These accounts minimized the political conflicts, regional loyalties, and practical considerations that had actually motivated much samurai behavior throughout history, creating instead a simplified and romanticized version of warrior culture that served contemporary political needs. Educational institutions played a crucial role in disseminating this reconstructed bushidō to the general population through textbooks, ceremonies, and moral instruction programs. The Imperial Rescript on Education, issued in 1890, incorporated samurai-derived values such as loyalty, filial piety, and self-sacrifice into a comprehensive framework for citizen education that applied to all social classes. Students throughout Japan learned to view these warrior virtues as essential elements of Japanese national character that distinguished their country from Western nations and provided the foundation for Japan's unique approach to modernization. Military education and training programs became primary vehicles for transmitting Bushido ideology to young Japanese men through the conscription system and military academies. The Imperial Japanese Army developed elaborate indoctrination procedures that presented military service as the highest expression of samurai values and the most direct way for ordinary citizens to participate in the warrior tradition. These programs emphasized the continuity between historical samurai and contemporary soldiers while adapting traditional concepts of honor and loyalty to support modern military discipline and tactical requirements. The influence of this militarized bushidō extended far beyond the armed forces to shape civilian attitudes toward authority, social relationships, and national purpose. Government propaganda and popular culture promoted the idea that all Japanese citizens should embody samurai virtues in their daily lives, whether as students, workers, or family members. This democratization of warrior values created a sense of shared identity and common purpose that facilitated social mobilization for national projects while reinforcing hierarchical relationships and obedience to authority. The evolution of Bushido ideology accelerated during periods of international conflict when the government sought to mobilize popular support for military campaigns. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 provided opportunities to demonstrate the practical effectiveness of samurai-inspired military training and national spirit. Victory in these conflicts validated the government's claims about the superiority of Japanese values and the continuing relevance of warrior traditions in the modern world. During the 1930s and early 1940s, Bushido ideology became increasingly extreme and militaristic as Japan moved towards total war with China and eventually the Allied powers. Government propagandists and military leaders promoted interpretations of samurai tradition that emphasized death before dishonor, absolute obedience to superiors, and willingness to sacrifice individual lives for national goals. These extreme versions of Bushido provided ideological justification for kamikaze attacks, civilian resistance to Allied occupation forces, and other desperate measures that reflected the military leadership's commitment to fighting until complete destruction rather than accepting defeat. The association of Bushido with Japanese militarism and wartime atrocities created serious problems for the survival of samurai cultural traditions in the post-war period. Allied occupation authorities, particularly American officials responsible for democratizing Japanese society, viewed traditional warrior values as incompatible with peaceful democratic governance and international cooperation. The new Japanese constitution, implemented in 1947, explicitly renounced war as a means of resolving international disputes and committed the nation to peaceful development based on democratic principles rather than military strength. The post-war re-examination of samurai culture involved complex processes of selective preservation, critical analysis, and creative reinterpretation that reflected both domestic needs and international pressures. Japanese intellectuals and cultural leaders faced the challenge of distinguishing valuable elements of their warrior heritage from the militaristic distortions that had contributed to the disasters of the Pacific War. This effort required careful historical research to understand what samurai culture had actually involved, as opposed to the idealized versions promoted by government propaganda during the imperial period. Academic historians played crucial roles in this re-examination process by conducting detailed studies of samurai society, politics, and culture based on primary sources rather than ideological assumptions. Their research revealed the complexity and diversity of historical warrior culture, challenging both the romanticized portrayals promoted by Meiji and wartime governments and the wholesale condemnations offered by critics of Japanese militarism. These scholarly investigations provided foundations for more nuanced understandings of samurai traditions that could appreciate their historical significance while acknowledging their limitations and contradictions. The romanticization of samurai culture in post-war literature, film, and popular media reflected both nostalgia for a heroic past and desire to reconstruct positive elements of Japanese identity after the trauma of defeat and occupation. Writers such as Mishima Yukio explored themes of honor, loyalty, and aesthetic perfection that drew on samurai traditions while addressing contemporary concerns about cultural authenticity and spiritual meaning in modern society. Their works presented complex and often contradictory portrayals of warrior culture that acknowledged both its attractions and its dangers. Cinema became perhaps the most influential medium for reshaping popular perceptions of samurai culture, both within Japan and internationally. Directors such as Kurosawa Akira created films that presented sophisticated and nuanced portrayals of warrior society, emphasizing individual moral struggles, rather than simple heroics or nationalist propaganda. Movies like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo depicted samurai as complex human beings facing difficult ethical choices in morally ambiguous situations, providing audiences with models of heroism that emphasize personal integrity rather than blind obedience to authority. The international success of Japanese samurai films introduced global audiences to warrior culture and created widespread fascination with Japanese martial traditions. These movies, while often historically inaccurate in their details, conveyed essential aspects of samurai values such as dedication to craft mastery, acceptance of mortality, and commitment to personal honor that resonated with viewers across cultural boundaries. The global popularity of samurai cinema contributed to the development of martial arts communities throughout the world and influenced popular culture in ways that continue to evolve. Contemporary manifestations of samurai legacy in Japanese business culture reflect both continuity with historical traditions and adaptation to modern economic requirements. Many Japanese corporations have adopted organizational principles and management practices that draw explicitly on samurai concepts of loyalty, hierarchy, and group solidarity. The lifetime employment system that characterized major Japanese companies during the post-war economic boom reflected samurai ideals of mutual obligation between lords and retainers, while corporate training programs often incorporated elements derived from traditional martial arts and warrior philosophy. The emphasis on consensus building, collective responsibility, and long-term thinking that distinguishes Japanese business practices from American or European approaches reflects cultural values that can be traced to samurai administrative traditions. The concept of nemawashi, involving extensive informal consultation before formal decision-making, mirrors the careful relationship management that characterized effective samurai leadership. Similarly, the Japanese focus on continuous improvement and perfectionist attention to detail reflects warrior traditions of disciplined practice and commitment to mastery. However, the application of samurai-derived values to modern business contexts has also created problems and limitations that reflect the tensions between traditional hierarchical relationships and contemporary economic requirements. The emphasis on loyalty and group harmony can discourage innovation and critical thinking, while rigid hierarchical structures may prevent organizations from responding quickly to changing market conditions. The economic challenges facing Japan during the 1990s and 2000s led many companies to reconsider their traditional management approaches and adopt more flexible practices that balance cultural continuity with practical effectiveness. The worldwide practice of Japanese martial arts represents perhaps the most direct contemporary connection to samurai traditions, though these activities have evolved far from their original military purposes. Arts such as kendo, judo, aikido and karate have attracted millions of practitioners throughout the world who seek physical fitness, mental discipline, and spiritual development through training methods derived from warrior traditions. These martial arts schools preserve technical knowledge and philosophical principles that connect contemporary students with centuries of samurai culture while adapting traditional practices to serve modern needs. The transformation of martial arts from combat training into systems of personal development reflects broader changes in how samurai traditions have been understood and utilized in the modern world. Contemporary martial arts emphasize character building, respect for others, and self-improvement rather than battlefield effectiveness or social domination. These modifications have made warrior-derived practices accessible to people of all backgrounds, while preserving essential elements of samurai culture that continue to offer value for personal growth and community building. The international martial arts community has also contributed to ongoing scholarly research into historical samurai culture by supporting academic studies, preserving traditional texts, and maintaining connections with Japanese cultural institutions. This global network of practitioners and scholars has created new opportunities for cross-cultural exchange and collaborative research that enhances understanding of warrior traditions while ensuring their continued evolution and adaptation. Ongoing scholarly research into samurai history continues to reveal new aspects of warrior culture while challenging mythologized narratives that have dominated popular understanding. Archaeological investigations of castle sites, analysis of newly discovered documents, and comparative studies with other warrior cultures have provided increasingly sophisticated pictures of how samurai society actually functioned. These research efforts have revealed the diversity and complexity of warrior experiences while highlighting the gaps between historical reality and later romantic interpretations. The distinction between historical facts and mythologized narratives remains a central concern for contemporary scholars seeking to understand the actual role of samurai in Japanese history. The accumulated layers of interpretation, ideological manipulation, and popular culture representation have created multiple versions of samurai culture that often contradict each other and bear little resemblance to historical evidence. Separating authentic historical information from later editions requires careful analysis of primary sources and critical evaluation of the political and cultural contexts that shaped different interpretations. Contemporary Japanese society continues to grapple with the legacy of samurai culture in ways that reflect both pride in historical achievements and awareness of the problems associated with militaristic interpretations of warrior traditions. Public discussions about constitutional revision, military spending, and Japan's international role often invoke samurai imagery and values, though usually in ways that emphasize peaceful applications of traditional virtues rather than aggressive nationalism. The challenge of maintaining cultural continuity while avoiding the mistakes of the past remains a central theme in Japanese political and cultural discourse. The enduring fascination with samurai culture throughout the world suggests that warrior traditions continue to offer insights and inspiration that transcend their specific historical context. The samurai emphasis on discipline, loyalty, and personal excellence resonates with contemporary concerns about character development, professional ethics, and meaningful achievement. However, the selective appropriation of samurai values requires careful consideration of their original context and potential consequences to avoid repeating the distortions that contributed to earlier disasters. The transformation of the samurai from medieval warriors into symbols of cultural identity and personal aspiration represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural adaptation in world history. Their journey from practical fighters defending regional interests to bureaucratic administrators, serving centralized government to inspirational figures in global popular culture, demonstrates the complex processes through which historical traditions evolve to meet changing social needs. The continuing evolution of samurai legacy suggests that these warrior traditions will remain relevant and influential as long as human societies value courage, dedication, and the pursuit of excellence, though their specific manifestations will undoubtedly continue to change in response to new challenges and opportunities. The story of the samurai ultimately reflects the broader human struggle to balance individual achievement with social responsibility, traditional values with practical adaptation, and cultural identity with universal aspirations. Their legacy serves as both inspiration and warning, demonstrating the potential for human excellence while illustrating the dangers of extremism and the importance of maintaining perspective about the proper role of warrior values in civilized society. As Japan and the world continue to evolve, the samurai tradition will likely continue to provide both guidance and caution for those seeking to understand the complex relationships between culture, politics, and human nature.